Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. Summer break had just begun, and the weight of 7th grade finally lifted from my shoulders. I was 13 that year, 2019, a time when most kids my age were glued to their phones or gaming consoles. Not me, though. My parents couldn't afford the latest technology, and our family vacations consisted of weekend trips to visit my grandmother 2 towns over. That's why when my best friend Samantha approached me with a glossy brochure for Camp Evergreen, I felt a surge of excitement hadn't experienced in years. The brochure showcased smiling girls canoeing across a serene lake, hiking through lush forests and gathering around crackling campfires. It looked like something straight out of a movie. Nothing like the mundane summers I was used to. My mom signed me up already, Samantha said, her eyes bright with anticipation. 2 full weeks, she said I could bring a friend, and I immediately thought of you. I stared at the pictures, tracing my finger over the pristine lake. Camp Evergreen was nestled in the mountains, approximately 3 hours from our hometown. The thought of being so far from home made my stomach twist with both excitement and apprehension. I've never been away from home that long, I admitted, but couldn't hide my growing enthusiasm. It'll be amazing, Samantha insisted. We'll swim, hike, make new friends. Please say yes. That evening I showed the brochure to my parents. To my surprise, they agreed almost immediately. My mother commented that it would be good for me to experience nature, instead of spending another summer helping her around the house. My father seemed relieved at the prospect of one less mouth to feed for 2 weeks. They weren't being cruel. Money was just always tight. In the days leading up to our departure, I packed and repacked my duffel bag, checked items off the camp's recommended list, and tried to imagine what awaited me. I'd never been a particularly adventurous child. The closest I'd come to camping was sleeping in our backyard when the summer heat made our house unbearable. The night before we left, I had my first nightmare. I was swimming in dark water, unable to see more than a few inches in front of me. Something brushed against my leg, a cold, firm grip that pulled me deeper. I woke gasping for air, my sheets damp with sweat. I dismissed it as pre-camp jitters and didn't mention it to anyone. I should have recognized it for what it was. A warning. The journey to Camp Evergreen was filled with Samantha's excited chatter and her mother's occasional interjections about her own camp experiences from decades ago. I half listened, watching through the window as suburban landscapes gave way to increasingly dense forests and winding mountain roads. As we turned onto a gravel path marked with a wooden sign reading, Camp Evergreen, Empowering Young Women, since 1972, I felt a peculiar sensation. The air seemed to thicken, and the lush trees lining the entrance cast long shadows across our path. The sun, bright and cheerful throughout our drive, now struggled to penetrate the dense canopy above. "We're here," Samantha squealed, pressing, her face against the window as a cluster of rustic cabins came into view. The main lodge was a massive log structure with a wraparound porch, where several adults in forest green polo shirts stood welcoming arrivals. Beyond it, I could see glimpses of the lake, its surface reflecting the afternoon light like a mirror. As we exited the car, the first thing that struck me was the silence. Despite dozens of girls and parents milling about, there was an unnatural stillness to the place. No birds sang in the trees, no insects buzzed. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Welcome to Camp Evergreen." A woman with a clipboard approached us, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I'm Ms. Winters, the camp director." Ms. Winters had the weathered look of someone who spent most of her time outdoors. Tanned skin, crow's feet around her eyes, and calloused hands. She checked our names off her list and assigned us to Cabin Pine, explaining that we'd meet our counselor at orientation. "You girls are in for a special summer," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "We have many exciting activities planned." Samantha's mother helped us carry our bags to our cabin, hugged us both tightly, and promised to return in 2 weeks. As her car disappeared down the gravel road, I felt a twinge of unease. I was now farther from home than I'd ever been, surrounded by strangers in an unfamiliar place. Cabin Pine was rustic but comfortable, with 6 bunk beds, a small bathroom, and wooden chests for our belongings. 4 other girls were already unpacking. Twins named Hannah and Haley, a tall girl called Brianna, and a quiet, intense-looking girl named Josephine. I heard they renovated all the cabins after what happened, Josephine said abruptly as she shoved clothes into a drawer. After what? I asked, selecting a bottom bunk near the window. Josephine looked around as if checking for eavesdroppers. You don't know? About the drowning? Before she could continue, the cabin door swung open and our counselor strode in. Iris was in her early 20s with a perpetual smile and boundless energy. She clapped her hands to get our attention. Welcome to Cabin Pine. Let's save the ghost stories for the campfire, shall we? She gave Josephine a pointed look. Orientation begins in 15 minutes at the main lodge. Don't be late. As we followed, Iris to the main lodge, Samantha nudged me. Don't let Josephine freak you out. Every camp has some story to scare the new kids. I nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Josephine's comment. The way our counselor had so quickly shut down the conversation seemed strange. What was the drowning she'd mentioned? And why did it necessitate cabin renovations? Orientation was a blur of rules, schedules, and introductions. We learned about the camp's history, founded by a woman who believed girls needed wilderness experiences to build character. The daily routine, wake at 7 a.m., lights out at 10 p.m., and the various activities available, swimming, canoeing, hiking, archery, crafts. Throughout the presentation, I found my attention drawn to the large windows overlooking the lake. The water was unnaturally still, a dark blue surface that reflected the surrounding trees like a perfect photograph. As the sun began to set, the lake's color deepened to an almost black hue. That lake gives me the creeps, Brianna whispered beside me. It's too quiet. She was right. Most lakes I'd seen had small waves, ripples from fish jumping, or water bugs skittering across the surface. This one was completely motionless, as if frozen in time. After orientation, we returned to our cabin for get-to-know-you games led by Iris. As we sat in a circle on the wooden floor, sharing facts about ourselves, I noticed Josephine's eyes, repeatedly drifting to the window facing the lake. When we finally crawled into our bunks that night, exhausted from the long day, I heard Josephine whispering from her bed across the room. Her name was Andrea Walsh, she said, barely audible. She drowned here in 1996. They never found her body. I pulled my blanket tighter around me, trying to block out her words, but sleep remained elusive for hours. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with dark water and reaching hands. Morning arrived with the blaring of a bugle across the campgrounds. I blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, casting warm patterns on the wooden floor. For a moment, the previous night's unease seemed foolish in the bright light of day. Iris herded us to the dining hall, a spacious building with long wooden tables and benches. The air was filled with the scent of bacon and pancakes, and the chatter of nearly 100 excited girls. Samantha and I filled our trays and found seats at a table with girls from Cabin Birch. Have you heard about the ghost? A freckled girl named Grace asked as she slid onto the bench across from us. Josephine mentioned something about a drowning, I admitted, keeping my voice low. Grace nodded eagerly. Andrea Walsh, she was our age, 13 when it happened. They say she went swimming alone at night. Against the rules, obviously. The next morning they found her clothes on the dock, but no Andrea. That's not what I heard, another girl interjected. I heard she was pushed by her counselor. That's ridiculous, Samantha said with an eye roll. If a counselor murdered a camper, the place would have been shut down. Not if they covered it up, Grace countered. My older sister came here 3 years ago. She said they don't let anyone swim in the deep part of the lake anymore. They've got buoys marking it off limits. I glanced out the window at the lake, visible in the distance. The morning sun glinted off its surface, making it appear almost inviting. It was hard to reconcile the beautiful scene with such a tragic story. Whatever happened, it was over 20 years ago, Samantha said firmly. I'm not letting some old story ruin my summer. After breakfast, our cabin group was scheduled for swimming lessons. We changed into our swimsuits and made our way down to the lake, where Iris and another counselor named Maya waited on the dock with clipboards. Up close, the lake was even more beautiful and more unsettling. The water was incredibly clear, near the shore, allowing visibility several feet down to the sandy bottom. Further out, however, it darkened rapidly, the bottom disappearing into blackness. The swimming area is marked by the yellow buoys, Iris explained, pointing to a roped-off section of the lake. Beyond that, the lake drops off quickly to over 30 feet deep. No one swims past the buoys, ever, understood? We all nodded solemnly. I couldn't help noticing how the other counselor, Maya, stared out at the deep water with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, something between fear and reverence. After assessing our swimming abilities, we were divided into groups. Being a strong swimmer, I was placed in the advanced group with Samantha, Brianna, and several girls from other cabins. We practiced strokes, while Iris watched from the dock, occasionally shouting instructions. The water was surprisingly warm for a mountain lake, almost unnaturally so. As I swam, I noticed how sound seemed to behave strangely underwater, muffled in a way that felt different from my experiences in public pools or the rare occasions I'd been to the beach. About 20 minutes into our lesson, I dove under to practice retrieving objects from the bottom. The counselors had tossed several colorful rings for us to retrieve. I spotted a red one near the boundary rope and swam toward it. As I reached for the ring, a shadow passed overhead, something large moving across the surface. Thinking it was another swimmer, I surfaced quickly, not wanting a collision. But when my head broke the water, I saw all the other girls still in their designated areas, none close enough to have cast the shadow I'd seen. The counselors remained on the dock, engaged in conversation. I treaded water, scanning the lake's surface. Nothing unusual was visible, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The back of my neck prickled with goosebumps despite the warm water. Everything okay? Samantha called from a few yards away. Yeah, I replied automatically, though nothing felt okay. Just thought I saw something. I returned to the group, but kept glancing back at the spot where I'd seen the shadow. For the remainder of the swimming lesson, I stayed in the shallowest part of the designated area, never letting my feet lose contact with the bottom. Later that afternoon, during free time, I sat on the cabin's small porch with my journal, trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. Perhaps it had been a large fish or a shadow from a passing cloud. The rational explanations didn't ease my discomfort. Josephine emerged from the cabin and sat beside me, her dark eyes studying my face with uncomfortable intensity. You felt it, didn't you? She asked quietly. In the lake. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Felt what? That we're not alone in there. Josephine hugged her knees to her chest. My older sister came here 4 years ago. She told me about Andrea, said the lake changed after she drowned, became warmer, quieter, like something's absorbing all the energy. It's just a lake, I said, not believing my own words. Josephine gave me a sad smile. Andrea's family demanded an investigation after she disappeared. The police brought in divers, sonar equipment, everything. They never found a trace of her. It's like the lake just swallowed her. People are found eventually, I argued. Bodies float. Not in Evergreen Lake, Josephine whispered. Nothing that goes into the deep part ever comes back up. Before I could respond, Iris called us for the next activity. As I stood to leave, Josephine grabbed my wrist, her fingers digging into my skin with surprising strength. Stay away from the deep water, she warned. Andrea isn't the only one who never came back. The next few days passed in a blur of scheduled activities, new friendships, and forced normalcy. I threw myself into camp life, determined to enjoy the experience despite the unease that lingered at the edges of my consciousness. Samantha, oblivious to my concerns, thrived in the environment, quickly becoming a favorite among counselors for her enthusiasm and leadership qualities. Our third day at camp brought our cabin's turn for canoeing lessons. After breakfast, we gathered at the boathouse, a weathered structure extending partly over the water. Inside, rows of canoes hung from the ceiling, their hulls gleaming with fresh varnish. "Today you'll learn basic paddling techniques and water safety," explained Mr. Harmon, the elderly caretaker who ran the boating program. His leathery skin and calloused hands spoke of decades spent outdoors. "Each of you will take a canoe out. Follow my instructions carefully." We were fitted with life, jackets and given paddles. One by one we climbed into canoes while Mr. Harmon and Iris steadied them against the dock. When my turn came, I hesitated, staring down at the water lapping against the wooden structure. "Something wrong?" Mr. Harmon asked, noticing my reluctance. "No," I lied, forcing myself to step into the narrow vessel. It wobbled beneath me, and I gripped the sides with white knuckles. "That's it," he encouraged as I settled onto the seat. "Keep your weight centered." He pushed my canoe away from the dock with surprising strength for his age. I dipped my paddle into the water as he demonstrated, making small, controlled strokes. The canoe glided smoothly across the surface, joining the others who were already practicing in a small cove near the boathouse. For several minutes, I felt a growing confidence. The repetitive motion of paddling was almost meditative, and the morning sun warmed my skin pleasantly. Perhaps I had been overthinking things. Perhaps the stories about Andrea Walsh were just that. Stories. Then I noticed I'd drifted away from the group. Despite maintaining what I thought was a straight course, my canoe had somehow veered toward the center of the lake, past the swimming buoys that marked the drop-off to deeper water. I corrected my course, digging my paddle deeper to turn back toward the cove. The canoe didn't respond as expected. Instead of turning, it continued its path toward deeper water, as if pulled by an invisible current. I paddled harder, my arms burning with the effort, yet made no progress toward the shore. "You're too far out," Iris called from the dock, her voice carrying across the water. "Turn back toward the cove." "I'm trying," I shouted back, fighting against the inexplicable pull. Mr. Harmon quickly launched another canoe, powerful strokes carrying him toward me. As he approached, my canoe suddenly lurched to one side, nearly capsizing. I dropped my paddle in surprise and grabbed the gunnels to steady myself. The paddle didn't float as it should have. Instead, it sank immediately, disappearing into the darkness below. As I watched it vanish, something in the depths caught my eye, a pale shape, moving against the blackness. Not the random movement of underwater currents, but the deliberate motion of something swimming, something large. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared into the water. The shape moved closer to the surface, growing more distinct. A face, human yet somehow wrong, materialized beneath my canoe. Pale, bloated features distorted by water and time, with dark holes where eyes should be. A mouth opened in what could have been a smile or a scream. I recoiled so violently that the canoe rocked dangerously. Water splashed over the sides, soaking my legs. The face disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only the dark water below. Mr. Harmon reached me moments later, expertly maneuvering his canoe alongside mine. "Grab my paddle," he instructed, extending it toward me. "I'll tow you back." With trembling hands, I clutched the offered paddle. Mr. Harmon began rowing us both toward shore, his weathered face set in a grim expression. "Did you see something in the water?" he asked quietly, his eyes scanning the lake's surface. I hesitated. Would he believe me? Would anyone? I thought I saw a face." His paddling faltered for just a moment before resuming its steady rhythm. "The sun plays tricks on these waters," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Reflections, shadows. Easy to see things that aren't there." But his eyes told a different story. They held knowledge, perhaps fear. He knew something about this lake that he wasn't sharing. Back on shore, Iris wrapped a towel around my shoulders, mistaking my shaking for cold rather than terror. "You drifted into the current," she explained, rubbing my arms briskly. It happens sometimes. That's why we always stay in the cove for lessons. What current? Samantha asked, standing nearby with the others. The lake looks perfectly still. Underwater currents, Mr. Harmon interjected. This lake has unusual hydrology. Underground springs create currents you can't see from the surface. The explanation sounded rehearsed, as if he'd given it many times before. The other girls accepted it without question, but I knew what I'd seen. No current had pulled my canoe. Something had wanted me in the deep water. That night, I lay awake long after lights out, listening to the steady breathing of my cabin mates. My mind replayed the face I'd seen, the hollow eyes, the grotesque smile. Was it Andrea Walsh, or something else entirely? Around midnight, I heard soft footsteps on the wooden floor. Peeking through barely opened eyes, I saw Josephine slip out the cabin door. Curiosity overrode my fear, and I quietly followed, grabbing a flashlight from beside my bunk. The night was moonless, the camp illuminated only by a few security lights along the main paths. I caught a glimpse of Josephine's silhouette heading toward the lake and followed at a distance, careful to avoid twigs and other noisy debris on the ground. She stopped at the edge of the dock, gazing out over the water. I hid behind a nearby tree, watching as she knelt and placed something on the wooden planks. Flowers, I realized, a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered from around the camp. "I know you're there," Josephine said suddenly, without turning around. "You can come out." Startled, I stepped from my hiding place. "What are you doing?" "Paying respects," she replied simply. Andrea's birthday was yesterday. She would have been 36. I approached cautiously, standing beside her on the dock. The lake before us was a vast expanse of blackness, not even stars reflected on its unusually still surface. "How do you know so much about her?" I asked. Josephine was quiet for a long moment. Andrea was my aunt, my mother's younger sister. The revelation struck me speechless. This wasn't just camp folklore to her. It was family history, personal tragedy. "My mother never got over it," Josephine continued. "She visits the lake every year on Andrea's birthday. This year she couldn't come, so I promised I'd leave flowers for her." "I'm sorry," I said inadequately, "about your aunt. They said she drowned accidentally." Josephine's voice hardened, but my mother never believed it. Andrea was an excellent swimmer, and she wasn't alone that night. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What do you mean?" "She was with her counselor, Ms. Winters." The name hit me like a physical blow. "The camp director? She was here when it happened?" Josephine nodded. "She was Andrea's counselor that summer. The police questioned her, but she claimed Andrea snuck out alone after lights out. No one could prove otherwise." My mind raced, connecting pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known existed. Ms. Winters' strange demeanor, the way the counselors avoided discussing the lake's history, Mr. Harmon's practiced explanation of underwater currents. "I saw something in the lake today," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could reconsider. "A face under my canoe." Josephine didn't seem surprised. "Others have seen her too. The camp covers it up, calls them hallucinations or tricks of light. But I know better." "What really happened to her?" I asked, dreading the answer. "I don't know for certain," Josephine replied, "but I intend to find out before camp ends, and I think you're meant to help me." As if in response to her words, the still surface of the lake suddenly rippled, a single perfect circle expanding outward from a central point, as if something large had risen briefly before sinking again into the depths. We both took an involuntary step back from the edge. "Something's happening," Josephine whispered. "The lake is changing. Andrea's getting stronger." "What do you mean stronger?" "Every year there are more sightings, more incidents. Last summer, a girl nearly drowned during a night swim. Said something grabbed her ankle and wouldn't let go." I thought of my canoe being pulled toward deeper water against all my efforts to turn back. We should tell someone. Who? Ms. Winters? The counselors? They're all part of it. Josephine gathered her flashlight. Meet me tomorrow night, after lights out. Bring your swimsuit. My swimsuit? Why would I? We're going to find proof, she interrupted. In the boathouse. There are records there, logs from every summer, including 1996. As we crept back to our cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just by whoever might be patrolling the grounds, but by something else. Something that dwelled in the unnaturally still waters of Evergreen Lake and had been waiting patiently for 23 years. The following day passed with excruciating slowness. Every activity, every meal, every conversation seemed to drag on endlessly as I waited for nightfall. I went through the motions of camp life mechanically, my mind preoccupied with what Josephine had shared and what we planned to do. Samantha noticed my distraction during archery practice. "Are you still freaked out about yesterday?" she asked. As we retrieved arrows from the target, Mr. Harmon said it was just underwater currents. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired. Didn't sleep well." "Is it Josephine?" "She's been glued to your side since yesterday." Samantha lowered her voice. "The twins told me she comes here every summer, but never makes friends. They think she's obsessed with that drowning story because she's related to the girl who died." "She told me," I admitted. "Andrea was her aunt." Samantha's eyes widened. "Seriously? That's morbid. Why would her parents keep sending her to the camp where her aunt died?" It was a good question, one I hadn't considered. Maybe they don't know she's investigating what happened. Investigating? What are you talking about? Realized I'd said too much and quickly backpedaled. Nothing, just that she's curious about it. Samantha studied my face for a moment, then shook her head. "Whatever she's dragged you into, be careful. The counselors already watch her like a hawk. You don't want that kind of attention." Her warning stayed with me throughout the day. I noticed for the first time how the counselors did indeed seem to track Josephine's movements more closely than the other campers. During swimming, Iris remained unnervingly close to her in the water. At lunch, Maya happened to sit at our table. During free time, there always seemed to be a staff member nearby when Josephine was around. Were they watching her because they knew about her connection to Andrea, or because they feared what she might discover? After dinner, as we walked back to our cabin, I pulled Josephine aside. "We're being watched," I whispered. "The counselors are always around you." "Now you're noticing," she replied with a grim smile. "It's been like this every summer since I started coming here 3 years ago. They know who I am." "Then why do you keep coming back?" Josephine's expression darkened. "Because every year, I get closer to the truth. Last summer, I found Andrea's name in an old registry in the main office. It had been crossed out, not just lined through, but violently scribbled over until the page tore. And your parents just let you come back? After what happened to your aunt?" "They don't know," she admitted. "They think I'm at a science camp in Springfield. My grandmother helps me. She never believed the accident story either." The depths of Josephine's deception stunned me. She had orchestrated an elaborate lie, maintained year after year, all to investigate her aunt's disappearance. Her determination was both admirable and frightening. "What do you think happened to her?" I asked. Josephine glanced around before answering, ensuring no one was within earshot. "I think Ms. Winters was involved. Maybe it was an accident, maybe not. But I know she lied about Andrea being alone that night." "How can you be sure?" "Because I found a photograph in the camp archives last summer. It showed Andrea with Ms. Winters on the dock, time-stamped 11:43 p.m., the night she disappeared. The revelation sent a chill through me. If Josephine was right, the camp director had lied to police and potentially covered up a death, possibly even murder. "The picture disappeared the next day," Josephine continued. "I went back to look at it again, and it was gone. That's when they started watching me more closely." That night, as the cabin settled into sleep, I lay awake, listening for Josephine's signal. Around midnight, I heard 3 soft taps on the wooden post beside my bunk, our agreed-upon code. I slipped out of bed, already dressed in shorts and a t-shirt over my swimsuit as Josephine had instructed. She waited by the door, a small backpack slung over her shoulder. We crept out silently, careful not to wake the others. The camp was eerily quiet. Even the usual chorus of frogs and crickets seemed subdued, as if the wildlife sensed something unnatural about this place. We moved from shadow to shadow, avoiding the security lights that illuminated the main paths. The boathouse loomed, ahead, a dark silhouette against the starry sky. Unlike the rest of the camp buildings, it extended partly over the water, built on thick wooden pillars sunk deep into the lake bed. During the day, it was a hub of activity. At night, it transformed into something foreboding. "There's a side door that's never locked," Josephine whispered as we approached. "The caretaker's forgetful." Sure enough, the small maintenance entrance swung open with minimal creaking when she pushed it. We slipped inside, closing it carefully behind us. The interior was pitch black. Josephine switched on a small flashlight, keeping its beam pointed downward to minimize the chance of being spotted from outside. The weak light revealed rows of canoes and kayaks hanging from the ceiling, creating strange, elongated shadows on the walls. "The office is this way," she murmured, leading me past equipment racks toward a small room at the back. The office was little more than a closet with a desk and filing cabinet. Josephine handed me the flashlight and began rifling through the drawers with practiced efficiency. "What exactly are we looking for?" I asked, nervously scanning the boathouse for any sign of movement. Incident reports, logbooks from 1996, anything about Andrea. She pulled out a dusty ledger. "Hold the light steady." As she flipped through the yellowed pages, I noticed something unusual. Water was seeping under the door, not from the direction of the lake, but from the main boathouse area we'd just passed through. "Josephine," I whispered urgently. "There's water coming in." She glanced down, frowning at the thin line of moisture advancing across the floor. "That's not possible. The boathouse is watertight." We both stared as the water continued to spread, soaking into the thin carpet. It didn't behave like normal water. It moved with purpose, seeming to reach toward us rather than simply flowing downhill. "We need to leave," I said, backing away until I hit the desk. "Now." Josephine shoved the ledger into her backpack. "Not yet. I found something." She pointed to an entry dated July 17th, 1996. "Look." The page detailed a water safety incident involving Camper AW and Counselor CW. It was vague, mentioning only that both had been out after curfew and that appropriate disciplinary measures were implemented. "CW," I read aloud. "Catherine Winters?" Josephine nodded grimly. "This proves they were together that night, but there's something strange about this entry. It's dated July 17th, but my mother always said Andrea disappeared on July 15th. Before I could process this discrepancy, a loud splash came from the main area of the boathouse. Not the gentle lapping of the lake against the pillars, but the distinctive sound of something large emerging from water. We froze, eyes locked on the door as water continued to seep underneath, now nearly an inch deep in the small office. "Someone's out there," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Not someone," Josephine corrected, her face pale in the flashlight's glow. Something. A heavy, wet sound like sodden footsteps moved across the boathouse floor, approaching the office. The doorknob turned slowly, metal grinding against metal. Josephine reacted first, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward a small window on the back wall. "Out! Now!" She pushed the window open and helped boost me through. I tumbled onto the narrow maintenance walkway that ran along the boathouse exterior, just a few feet above the water. Josephine followed seconds later, pulling the window closed behind her. "Run!" she hissed, pointing toward the shore. We sprinted along the walkway, our footsteps thundering on the wooden planks. Behind us, the window shattered outward, glass tinkling. into the lake. Something dark and glistening pushed through the opening, an arm impossibly elongated and dripping with lake water. The walkway ended abruptly at a small platform. Below us was the lake, black and forbidding in the starlight. To our right, a short jump away, was the main dock that led back to shore. "We have to jump to the dock," Josephine said, already positioning herself for the leap. "On 3. 1, 2. She never reached 3. From beneath the walkway, something surged upward, splintering the wood beneath our feet. I fell backward, narrowly avoiding the grasping fingers that punched through the planks. Josephine wasn't as lucky. A pale hand, bloated and inhuman, clamped around her ankle. She screamed. A sound quickly cut short as she was yanked downward with impossible strength. The walkway collapsed further, and Josephine disappeared into the black water with barely a splash. "Josephine!" I screamed, scrambling to the edge of the broken platform. The lake's surface was already smooth again, as if nothing had disturbed it. Without thinking, I dove in. The water was shockingly warm, almost body temperature. Beneath the surface, I opened my eyes, expecting the sting of lake water. Instead, I could see with unnatural clarity in what should have been total darkness. Josephine was being pulled downward, her struggles growing weaker as she descended. Above her, or rather around her, was a figure so horrifying my mind initially refused to process what I was seeing. It wasn't a girl or even a human as I'd expected. The thing dragging Josephine into the depths was a nightmarish amalgamation of disparate parts. Limbs of different sizes fused together around a central mass. Multiple faces partially merged into one another. I recognized the face I'd seen beneath my canoe among them, but it was just one of many. With a surge of desperate strength, I swam deeper, reaching for Josephine's outstretched hand. Our fingers touched, then clasped. I pulled with all my might, kicking toward the surface. The thing, I couldn't think of it as Andrea anymore, tightened its grip on Josephine's leg. A sound vibrated through the water. Not quite a voice, but communicating unmistakable rage. More limbs extended from the central mass, reaching for me. My lungs burned for air. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. In a final, desperate effort, I yanked Josephine upward, simultaneously kicking at the grotesque appendage that held her. To my shock, the limb broke off, dissolving into the water like ink. The creature recoiled, its many faces contorting in silent screams. With the last of my strength, I pulled Josephine toward the surface. We broke through together, gasping and choking. The dock was just a few yards away. I dragged her toward it, heaving her onto the wooden planks before hauling myself up beside her. What was that thing?" Josephine sputtered between coughs. Before I could answer, lights flared across the camp. Shouts echoed as counselors and staff emerged from their cabins, alerted by our screams. "It wasn't Andrea," I managed, my voice raw. "It was everyone. Everyone who's gone into that lake and never come back." Understanding dawned in Josephine's eyes, followed by horror. "It's collecting them," she whispered. "All this time we thought it was just Andrea, but it's been—" "What in God's name are you two doing?" Ms. Winter's voice cut through the night as she strode down the dock, flanked by two counselors. Her face, illuminated by the flashlight she carried, was twisted with an emotion that went beyond anger. It was fear. "We know what's in the lake," Josephine said, struggling to her feet. "We know what happened to Andrea. What's been happening for years." Ms. Winters went very still. "Take these two to the infirmary," she instructed the counselors. "They're in shock. Hypothermia, most likely." "We're telling everyone," I threatened, finding courage in the aftermath of terror. "About the records, about what's really in the lake." "No one will believe you," Ms. Winters replied coldly. "Two hysterical girls who broke curfew to go swimming? You'll be sent home for endangering yourselves, nothing more." As the counselors led us away, I glanced back at the lake. Its surface was perfectly still once more, but I knew now what lurked beneath. Not a ghost, not a drowned girl seeking revenge, but something far worse. Something that had been feeding on the camp's secrets for decades, and Ms. Winters knew all about it. The infirmary was a small building near the main lodge, equipped with basic medical supplies and 4 narrow beds. The camp nurse, Mrs. Bennett, checked us over with clinical efficiency, clucking her tongue at our soaked clothes and scraped limbs. "Hypothermia risk, possible shock," she muttered, wrapping thermal blankets around our shoulders. "What possessed you girls to go swimming at this hour?" Neither Josephine nor I answered. We sat side by side on one of the beds, shivering despite the warmth of the room. It wasn't cold that made us tremble, but the memory of what we'd seen in the lake's depths. Ms. Winters entered after a brief conversation with the counselors outside. Her face was composed now, the fear I'd seen earlier carefully masked behind a professional demeanor. "Mrs. Bennett, would you give us a moment?" she asked. "I need to speak with the girls about the seriousness of their actions." The nurse hesitated, glancing between us and the camp director. "They should rest. It won't take long," Ms. Winters insisted, her tone leaving no room for argument. Once we were alone, Ms. Winters closed the blinds on the infirmary windows and turned to face us. In the harsh fluorescent lighting, I noticed details about her I hadn't before, the unnatural tightness around her eyes, Ms. Winters studied me with a mixture of pity and resignation. The indigenous people who lived here believed it could only be appeased through sacrifice. That's why they abandoned this area centuries ago. Too many of their children went missing. "We're not sacrificing anyone," Josephine stated flatly. "No," Ms. Winters agreed, "which is why you're both leaving tomorrow, and why neither of you will speak of this again to anyone." "Or what?" I challenged. "Mims." Winters leaned close, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Or I can't protect you. Not from the thing in the lake, and not from what would happen if the truth got out. The camp would close, yes, but I'm not the only one marked by it. There are others, people in positions of authority who've helped keep this quiet over the years, people who've made their own arrangements with what lives in those waters." The implication was clear. This conspiracy extended beyond the camp, perhaps to local officials or others who had encountered the entity and been changed by it, as Ms. Winters had been. "Get some rest," she said, rising to leave. "Your parents will be called first thing in the morning." After she left, Josephine and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. "We can't just leave," she finally said, not knowing what we know now. "What choice do we have?" I asked. "You heard her. That thing is beyond our ability to fight." Josephine's expression hardened with determination. "Andrea is in there. Part of her, anyway. I can't leave her like that. And if we do nothing, more girls will be taken." "What are you suggesting?" She reached into her still damp backpack and pulled out the ledger we'd stolen from the boathouse. "There might be something in here. Records of other incidents, maybe information about the lake's history that could help us understand what we're dealing with." We spent the next hour poring over the water-damaged pages, searching for any clue that might help us confront the entity. Most entries were mundane: equipment maintenance, weather conditions, scheduling notes. But scattered throughout were cryptic references to containment protocols and boundary maintenance. "Look at this," Josephine said, pointing to an entry from 1998. "Annual reinforcement of ward stones completed. Perimeter secure for another season." "Ward stones?" I repeated. "That sounds like someone's been keeping that thing contained in the lake," Josephine finished. "All this time there's been something holding it back, preventing it from extending its reach beyond the water." Further entries confirmed our theory. Every spring before camp opened, Mr. Harmon and Ms. Winters performed some kind of ritual around the lake's perimeter, placing or reinforcing ward stones at key locations. That's why it can pull people in but can't come out itself, I realized. These stones form a barrier. "A barrier that's weakening," Josephine added grimly, pointing to more recent entries noting deterioration at the northwest marker and increasing pressure on the southern boundary. The most recent entry, dated just 3 weeks earlier, was particularly disturbing. "Containment failing. Estimate complete breach within 1 season if reinforcement impossible. Alternative measures may be necessary." Alternative measures, I echoed. What does that mean? Josephine closed the ledger, her expression grim. I think Ms. Winters has been planning something desperate. A thought occurred to me then, so terrible I almost couldn't voice it. What if that's why you're here? Why? Your parents suddenly allowed you to come to the camp where your aunt died. What are you saying? Ms. Winters said the indigenous people believed the entity could be appeased through sacrifice. What if she's been guiding certain girls here? Girls connected to previous victims. The color drained from Josephine's face. You think she brought me here as a potential sacrifice? To appease that thing? Or to save everyone else, I said quietly. If the containment is failing, and she's tried everything else. Before Josephine could respond, the infirmary door opened. Mrs. Bennett returned, looking tired but professional. You girls should try to sleep. We've called your parents, but they won't be able to pick you up until morning. We exchanged a look, silently agreeing to continue our discussion later. As Mrs. Bennett checked our temperatures and blood pressure one final time, I noticed something I'd missed before. A small tattoo on her wrist, partially hidden by her watch. It appeared to be a symbol, concentric circles with lines radiating outward, like a stylized sun or star. The same symbol I'd seen etched into the dock pillars and on stones around the lake's edge. The nurse caught me staring and quickly pulled her sleeve down. Try to rest, she said, her tone suddenly cooler. You've had quite a shock. After she left, I whispered to Josephine. She has the symbol, the ward symbol. They're all in on it, Josephine whispered back. The whole staff must be involved in containing that thing. Or serving it, I suggested darkly. We fell into uneasy silence, both pretending to sleep while our minds raced with the horrifying implications of what we'd discovered. Outside, the night grew deeper, and somewhere beyond the infirmary walls, the lake waited, patient, hungry, and increasingly unbound. Dawn arrived with a tentative knock on the infirmary door. Iris entered, carrying fresh clothes for both of us. Her usually cheerful demeanor was subdued, her movements stiff as she placed the clothes at the foot of our beds. Your parents have been called, she informed us, avoiding eye contact. They'll arrive around noon. Ms. Winters would like to speak with you both after breakfast. We know about the wardstones, I said bluntly, watching for her reaction. Iris froze momentarily, then continued smoothing out the clothes as if I hadn't spoken. Breakfast is in 20 minutes. I'll come back to escort you. Is that why you're all here? Josephine pressed. To maintain the containment? To feed it when necessary? Iris finally looked at us, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. You don't understand what you're dealing with, neither of you do. She lowered her voice. Just go home. Forget about this place. Forget what you saw. Like you've forgotten the girls it's taken? I challenged. Something flashed in Iris's eyes. Anger. Or perhaps guilt. We remember everyone, she said quietly. Their names are carved on the stones that keep that thing from spreading beyond the lake. Their sacrifice protects countless others. This confirmation of our worst suspicions left us momentarily speechless. Iris used our silence to retreat, pausing at the door. 20 minutes. Be ready. After she left, Josephine and I dressed quickly, both processing what we'd learned. We need to see those stones, Josephine said as she pulled on the camp-issued sweatshirt. The complete circle of them. Maybe there's a way to strengthen the containment without more sacrifices. Or a way to destroy the entity entirely, I added. If there was, don't you think they would have done it by now? Ms. Winters has been trapped here for 23 years. She's had every reason to find a solution. She had a point. Whatever lived in the lake had resisted all attempts to destroy it for centuries. Even the indigenous people had eventually abandoned the area rather than continue fighting it. Then what do we do? I asked. Josephine zipped her backpack, which still contained the stolen ledger. First, we play along. Let them think we're cooperating. Then, before our parents arrive, we find those ward stones and see for ourselves what we're dealing with. Breakfast was a tense affair. The other campers watched us curiously as we entered the dining hall with Iris. Rumors had clearly spread about our nighttime adventure, though I doubted anyone had guessed the truth. Samantha approached our table, concern evident on her face. "Are you okay? Everyone's saying you went swimming in the middle of the night and nearly drowned." "We're fine," I assured her, attempting a casual tone. "Just did something stupid. Our parents are coming to get us later." "Both of you?" "But camp just started," Samantha protested. "Can't you talk to Ms. Winters, explain it was just a mistake?" If only she knew how impossible that was. "It's complicated," I said. "I'll call you when I get home, explain everything." Though I had no intention of telling Samantha the truth. Some knowledge was too dangerous, too burdensome. Let her enjoy her summer, unaware of what lurked beneath the placid surface of Evergreen Lake. After breakfast, Iris escorted us to Ms. Winters' office in the main lodge. The camp director sat behind a large oak desk, looking as if she hadn't slept. The strange mottling on her skin seemed more pronounced in the morning light, extending visibly up her neck. "Your parents will be here in a few hours," she began without preamble. "Until then, you'll remain under supervision. No wandering, no talking to other campers about what happened last night." "We know about the ward stones," Josephine said, repeating what we'd told Iris. "We know you've been using them to contain the entity in the lake." Ms. Winters' expression didn't change. "Then you understand the gravity of the situation. This isn't some ghost story or urban legend. What lives in that lake has been there since before European settlers arrived. It's patient, intelligent, and growing stronger." "The ledger mentioned the containment is failing," I said. "What happens when it breaks completely?" Ms. Winters sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of her years and more. "First, the water will rise. The lake will expand beyond its natural boundaries. Then, it will begin to spread its influence. Dreams at first, calling to people for miles around. Those who answer the call will walk into the water voluntarily, adding to its mass. Eventually, it won't need the water at all. It will be able to extend itself onto land." The horror of this scenario struck us both silent. It wasn't just Camp Evergreen at risk, but potentially the entire region. "How long?" Josephine finally asked. "At the current rate of deterioration? By next summer, the containment will fail completely." Ms. Winters leaned forward. "That's why we've been researching alternatives, ways to strengthen the ward stones or other solutions." "Sacrifices," I said flatly, "like the indigenous people used to do." Ms. Winters didn't deny it. "Voluntary ones, if possible. Those already marked by the lake, who carry a piece of it within them, like me." The implication stunned us. "You're planning to sacrifice yourself?" Josephine asked. "I've been preparing for it for years," Ms. Winters confirmed, "strengthening my connection to the entity, learning its patterns, its weaknesses, such as they are. When the time comes, I'll offer myself willingly. It may buy another decade of containment. Or it might make it stronger," I countered. "If you're already partially merged with it, your sacrifice could be exactly what it needs to break free completely." Doubt flickered across Ms. Winters' face. "That's a possibility we've considered, but the alternatives are worse." "There has to be another way," Josephine insisted. "Something in the camp's history or in the indigenous lore about the lake." Ms. Winters was quiet for a moment, studying us both. "There is one account. From the 1800s, when the first European settlers came to this area, a traveling preacher claimed to have confronted the entity and driven it deeper into the lake, weakening it temporarily." "How?" I pressed, desperate for any solution that didn't involve human sacrifice. "The account is fragmented. Something about purification through sacred flame and binding the water with earth and air. most likely religious symbolism rather than literal instructions. Ms. Winters shook her head. We've tried everything over the years. Fire, chemicals, even explosives placed strategically around the lake. Nothing affects it. But something in her words had triggered a memory. Mr. Harmon's careful explanation of the lake's unusual hydrology and underground springs. The springs, I said suddenly. The underwater currents. That's how it spreads its influence, isn't it? Through the water system beneath the lake. Ms. Winters looked surprised at my insight. Yes. The entity isn't confined to the lake itself. It extends through the underground water table. The ward stones create a perimeter that prevents it from expanding further, but they don't affect the deep connections. So to truly contain it, you'd need to cut off those underground connections, Josephine reasoned. Seal the springs somehow. Precisely what we've been unable to do, Ms. Winters confirmed. We've consulted geologists, hydrologists, discreetly, of course. The spring system is too extensive, too deep. We'd need to essentially restructure the entire lake bed. An idea was forming in my mind. An impossible, dangerous idea that nonetheless felt right. What if you didn't need to seal every spring? What if you just needed to change what flows through them? Both Josephine and Ms. Winters looked at me questioningly. The entity is water-based, I continued, thinking aloud. Everything we've seen suggests it needs water to maintain its form and influence. What if we introduced something into the spring system that would make the water inhospitable to it? We've tried chemicals, Ms. Winters reminded me. Industrial-strength compounds that would have killed any natural organism. The entity simply absorbed them, incorporated them into itself. Not chemicals, I said. Something elemental, something natural that opposes water. Understanding dawned on Josephine's face. Fire, not literal flames, but its essence. Heat. The geothermal vents, Ms. Winters breathed, her eyes widening. There's a dormant geothermal system beneath this region. It's why the lake never freezes even in the deepest winter. If those vents could be activated somehow, I suggested, the increased heat might drive the entity back, weaken it enough that the ward stones could fully contain it again. Ms. Winters was already moving, pulling old maps and geological surveys from a cabinet behind her desk. The original camp builders considered using the geothermal energy for heating, but abandoned the idea as too costly. The surveys should still be here. She spread several yellowed documents across her desk. We gathered around, examining diagrams of the lake and the surrounding geological features. One map, dated 1962, showed the network of springs feeding into the lake, with several larger ones marked in red. These are the main intake points, Ms. Winters explained, pointing to the red markings. If we could introduce enough heat here, here, and here, it might create a natural barrier. How do we activate dormant geothermal vents? Josephine asked, the practical question bringing us back to reality. Ms. Winters straightened, a new determination in her bearing. There are methods, drilling, hydraulic stimulation, but they require specialized equipment, expertise. And time, I added, which we don't have. Our parents will be here in a few hours. Leave that to me, Ms. Winters said with surprising resolve. I can delay them, create some excuse about road closures or administrative procedures. Josephine looked skeptical. Why are you suddenly willing to help us? You were ready to send us home and continue with your sacrifice plan. Ms. Winters' expression softened slightly. Because in 23 years, you're the first to suggest something we haven't tried. Something that addresses the root of the problem, rather than just containing its symptoms. She moved to her desk phone and dialed a number. Mr. Harmon, meet me in my office immediately, and bring the old geological equipment from Storage Shed 3. After hanging up, she turned back to us. If we're going to do this, we need to move quickly. The entity will sense what we're attempting. It will try to stop us. How? I asked, suddenly fearful. It's confined to the lake. Its physical form is, Ms. Winters corrected, but its influence extends further. It can affect weather patterns. Near the lake, manipulate local wildlife and, she hesitated, work through those it has marked. She rolled up her sleeve again, revealing the mottled skin beneath. Like me, part of me belongs to it already. If it senses a true threat, it might be able to override my resistance. Then we need help, Josephine declared. People who haven't been marked, who can continue if you're compromised. Ms. Winters nodded reluctantly. Mr. Harmon has remained relatively unaffected. He never enters the water. And there's Mrs. Bennett. She joined us only 2 years ago, primarily to help research potential solutions. What about Iris and the other counselors, I asked. To varying degrees, all the long-term staff have been influenced. It's unavoidable when you spend years near the lake, but some have developed more resistance than others. The door opened and Mr. Harmon entered, carrying a large metal case. His weathered face registered surprise at seeing us, then understanding as he took in the maps spread across the desk. You're going to attempt stimulation, he stated, rather than asked. Ms. Winters nodded. These two have provided insight we've been missing. We need to target the mainsprings, introduce enough heat to drive the entity back and weaken its hold. Mr. Harmon set down the case and opened it, revealing an array of sophisticated equipment. Drilling attachments, measuring devices, and what appeared to be small explosive charges. These were left by the Geological Survey team in the 70s, he explained, noticing my alarmed expression. Controlled charges designed to open blocked thermal vents. We considered using them years ago but couldn't determine the correct placement points. The ward stones, Josephine said suddenly. They must be positioned at key points around the lake. Places where the entity's influence is strongest. Ms. Winters looked impressed. Yes, they correspond to the main spring outlets. Then that's where we place the charges, I concluded. Not to destroy the ward stones, but to use their positions as guides for accessing the underground system. As Mr. Harmon and Ms. Winters began discussing technical details, I felt a strange sensation, a pressure behind my eyes, accompanied by a faint humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. From Josephine's pained expression, I could tell she felt it too. It knows, I whispered to her. It's aware of what we're planning. Outside, the weather was changing rapidly. The clear morning sky had darkened with ominous clouds that seemed to gather directly over the lake. A wind had risen, bending the trees along the shoreline. We need to move quickly, Ms. Winters announced, gathering the maps. Mr. Harmon, assemble a team. Mrs. Bennett, Iris, if you think she's strong enough, and Max from maintenance. Tell them only what they absolutely need to know. What about us? Josephine asked. Ms. Winters hesitated. You should remain here where it's safer. No, I said firmly. We discovered this solution. We're seeing it through. And Andrea was my aunt, Josephine added. I have a right to be there if there's any chance of freeing her from that thing. After a moment's consideration, Ms. Winters nodded. Very well. But you follow instructions precisely. No heroics, no deviations from the plan. Understood? We both agreed, though I wondered if any plan could truly prepare us for confronting the entity again. As we exited the office, the wind outside had strengthened to a gale, and distant thunder rolled across the sky. The lake, visible through the lodge windows, was no longer still. Its surface roiled with waves that seemed to move against the wind, as if something enormous was stirring in its depths. The storm intensified as our small group made its way toward the lake. Wind whipped through the trees, sending branches crashing to the ground around us. The sky had darkened to an unnatural shade of green-black, and lightning flashed directly over the water with increasing frequency. It's fighting back, Ms. Winters shouted over the wind. The entity controls the local weather patterns when threatened. Our group consisted of 7 people. Ms. Winters, Mr. Harmon, Mrs. Bennett, Max, a burly maintenance worker, Iris, Josephine, and myself. We carried equipment distributed among waterproof backpacks, drilling attachments, the small explosive charges, and various measuring devices. Mr. Harmon led us not to the main dock, but to a less used trail that circled the lake. We need to access all 12 wardstones, he explained. They form a complete perimeter around the water. The first stone was located in a small clearing about 50 yards from the shore. It appeared unremarkable at first glance, just a rough boulder about waist high. But as we approached, I could see the elaborate symbols carved into its surface. Concentric circles, radiating lines, and strange angular glyphs that seemed to shift when viewed directly. More striking was the name carved at the stone's base, Andrea Walsh. Josephine stopped abruptly upon seeing it. "You used her name," she said to Ms. Winters, accusation in her voice. "You bound her to this place even after death." "Not my choice, Ms." Winters replied grimly. "The stones draw power from connection. Names have power, especially the names of those the entity has claimed. They help maintain the barrier." Mr. Harmon had already begun setting up equipment, unfazed by the increasingly violent weather. He attached a narrow drill bit to a portable motor and began carefully boring into the ground beside the stone. "The ward stones are positioned directly above the main spring outlets," Ms. Winters explained as we watched. "We need to create access, points approximately 15 feet deep to reach the water channels." The drill made surprisingly quick progress through the soil and underlying rock. Once it reached the desired depth, Mr. Harmon withdrew it and prepared one of the small cylindrical charges. "These are designed for geological work," he assured us, noting our nervous expressions. "Highly directed, minimal collateral impact. They'll create fissures that allow the deeper geothermal heat to rise into the spring channels." As he lowered the charge into the hole, a horrific screeching sound cut through the storm's noise. It came from the lake, a sound no natural creature could make, like metal tearing combined with 1,000 voices crying out in unison. The water began to rise visibly, swelling toward the shore in defiance of natural tides or wind patterns. A thick mist formed above its surface, rapidly spreading toward us. "It's extending itself," Ms. Winters warned. "Everyone stay back from the water's edge." Mr. Harmon finished setting the first charge and activated its timer. 10 minutes, he announced. "We need to move quickly to the next position." We hurried along the trail to the second ward stone, fighting against wind that seemed deliberately intent on pushing us toward the encroaching water. The mist had reached the shoreline now, advancing through the trees like seeking tendrils. The second stone bore another name, Eleanor Price, 2007. One of the 3 victims Ms. Winters had mentioned from her 23 years at the camp. Mr. Harmon repeated the drilling process while Max and Mrs. Bennett kept watch on the approaching mist. "If it touches you, don't panic," Ms. Winters instructed. "It's attempting to establish connection, to access your thoughts. Focus on something concrete, a memory, a name, a simple counting pattern. Don't let your mind wander." As if summoned by her warning, the mist surged forward suddenly, enveloping our group before we could retreat. It was warm and thick, clinging to skin and clothes with unnatural persistence. And within it I heard voices, whispers at first, then clearer communications. "Join us. Be part of something greater. No more pain. No more fear. Only belonging." The voices were seductive, promising peace and acceptance. I found myself taking an involuntary step toward the lake, drawn by their hypnotic quality. "Focus!" Ms. Winters shouted, her voice seeming to come from a great distance. "Ground yourselves." With tremendous effort, I pulled my thoughts back, concentrating on a simple multiplication table. 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8. Anything to drown out the enticing whispers. Not everyone was successful. Iris had begun walking steadily toward the water, her eyes glazed and unfocused. Max lunged forward, grabbing her arm and physically restraining her. "Finished," Mr. Harmon announced, activating the second charge. "Next location quickly." We moved as a group, supporting those who struggled against the entity's influence. The mist followed, thickening around us. Through breaks in the fog, I could see the lake water had risen several feet, now lapping at areas of the camp that should have been well above the shoreline. The third ward stone bore the name Maria Gonzalez, 2013. The fourth, Samuel Winters. Josephine noticed the last name immediately. A relative? She asked Ms. Winters. My husband, the camp director replied, her voice hollow. He came looking for me after I couldn't leave. The entity took him instead. This revelation cast Ms. Winters' decades-long vigil in a new light. She hadn't just been trapped here by the mark on her skin. She'd been bound by grief and guilt as well. By the sixth stone, the first charge detonated. The ground shook beneath our feet, and from the direction of the first ward stone, a plume of steam erupted. A moment later, an unearthly howl rose from the lake, the entity's response to the first successful geothermal breach. It's working, Mrs. Bennett confirmed, checking readings on a thermometer-like device. Water temperature at the first spring is rising rapidly. The entity's reaction was immediate and violent. The mist around us congealed, becoming almost solid in consistency. It pressed against us from all sides, seeking entry through every available opening, nostrils, mouths, even the pores of our skin. Ms. Winters suddenly collapsed, convulsing on the ground. Her skin rippled as if something moved beneath it, and when she opened her eyes, they were completely black. You cannot stop what has always been, she said, her voice overlaid with countless others speaking in unison. This vessel has served us faithfully. Now all of you will join the collective. Mr. Harmon reacted without hesitation, dragging Ms. Winters away from the equipment as she thrashed and clawed at him. Continue the work, he shouted to Max and Mrs. Bennett. Complete the circle. The second charge detonated, then the third in quick succession. Each blast sent more steam rising from the ground, and with each release the entity's howls grew more desperate. We pushed forward through the mist, completing the preparations at each ward stone. My lungs burned from the effort of filtering the thick air, and my skin crawled with the sensation of countless invisible fingers probing for weakness. Josephine stayed close beside me, her face set in grim determination. 3 more, she encouraged as we reached the 10th stone. We're almost there. The lake had risen to unprecedented levels, flooding much of the camp. From our elevated position on the trail, we could see cabins partially submerged, the main dock completely underwater. The entity was throwing its full might against us, using the very element it controlled as a weapon. As Max finished drilling at the 11th stone, a massive surge of water burst from the lake, forming into a towering column that defied physics and gravity. At its center was a shape, a grotesque amalgamation of human features partially formed and constantly shifting. Multiple limbs extended from a central mass, and faces pressed outward from within, mouths open in silent screams. Among them, I recognized the face I'd seen beneath my canoe, young female with an expression of eternal torment. Andrea Walsh, or what remained of her. Andrea! Josephine cried out, taking an involuntary step toward the apparition. It's not her. I grabbed Josephine's arm, pulling her back. Not anymore. It's using her image to manipulate you. The water column surged forward, sweeping across the ground toward us. Mr. Harmon shouted a warning, but too late. The leading edge engulfed Max before he could retreat. We watched in horror as he was lifted off his feet, his body seeming to dissolve into the churning mass. The charge, Mrs. Bennett screamed. It's still in his hand. Indeed, the final explosive was clutched in Max's partially subsumed fist as the entity absorbed him. If we couldn't retrieve it or activate it, our entire plan would fail at the final step. Without thinking, I lunged forward, reaching into the water column for the charge. The liquid felt alive, clinging to my arm with conscious malevolence. Faces pressed against my skin. Max is among them now, his features already blurring as he was assimilated into the collective. My fingers brushed against the metal cylinder. With a supreme effort, I closed my hand around it and yanked backward. The entity resisted, pulling against me. For a terrible moment, I felt myself being drawn inward, my consciousness beginning to fragment as hundreds of voices crowded into my mind. Then Josephine was beside me, her arms around my waist, pulling with all her strength. Together we tore free, falling backward onto solid ground with the charge clutched in my burning hand. Mr. Harmon didn't waste a moment. He grabbed the device, rushed to the 11th drilling site and dropped it in, activating the timer. "Final position," he shouted, already moving toward the 12th ward stone. The entity's water column collapsed, splashing back to the ground but immediately beginning to reform. We ran the final 100 yards to the last stone, which stood atop a small rise overlooking the lake. This stone was different from the others, larger, more elaborately carved, and bearing no single name. Instead, it was covered with dozens of names, dates stretching back centuries. At its base, a small depression had been carved out, lined with metal that gleamed dully in the stormlight. "The Master Stone," Mrs. Bennett explained as Mr. Harmon began drilling. "The focal point of the entire containment system. The 12 stones form a circle, but this one channels their energy." The 11th charge detonated, and the entity's scream reached a new pitch of rage and pain. The water column had reformed larger than before, surging toward our position with frightening speed. "It knows what we're doing," Mrs. Bennett said, her voice surprisingly calm. "It will throw everything it has at us now," Mr. Harmon finished, drilling and prepared to place the final charge. As he reached for the detonator, the ground beneath us trembled violently. A fissure opened between him and the hole, nearly swallowing him before he leaped clear. "I can't reach it," he shouted, as the crack widened. The water column was almost upon us, its leading edge morphing into grasping hands and snarling mouths. Within its mass, I could now see not just Andrea and Max, but Ms. Winters as well, her form distorted but recognizable among the countless others. Josephine stepped forward, the final charge in her hand. She had retrieved it when Mr. Harmon dropped it. "I'll do it," she said, determination in every line of her body. "For Andrea." Before anyone could stop her, she leaped across the widening fissure, landing precariously on the other side. The entity surged forward, water crashing around her legs as she knelt by the drill hole. "Josephine!" I screamed, watching in horror as the water began to creep up her body. She looked back at me one last time, a sad smile on her face. "Tell my mother what really happened," she called. "Tell her Andrea wasn't alone." With that, she dropped the charge into the hole and pressed the detonator. The entity's water engulfed her completely just as the ground beneath the Master Stone erupted in a geyser of steam and superheated water. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the entity. A chain reaction spread from the Master Stone to each of the 11 other sites, creating a circle of roaring geysers around the lake. The water column collapsed entirely, unable to maintain cohesion as the temperature rose. From the lake itself came a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, not rage or pain, but something more complex. It reminded me of ice cracking on a frozen pond multiplied 1,000-fold. The surface of the water began to literally fracture, as if it were a solid mass breaking apart. Steam rose in massive clouds, obscuring our view of the lake and most of the camp. The wind, which had been howling around us, stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the hissing of the geysers and the continuing crack of the lake's surface. When the steam finally cleared enough for us to see, the lake had changed fundamentally. Its water level had dropped dramatically, revealing long submerged features of the lake bed. But more significantly, the water itself had changed. No longer the unnaturally clear dark blue it had been, but a cloudy, mineral-rich turquoise typical of geothermal pools. Where Josephine had stood, there was no sign remaining. The Master Stone had cracked down the middle, its elaborate carvings disrupted but still partially legible. Mr. Harmon approached it cautiously, testing the ground with each step. "It worked," he said in disbelief. "The geothermal activation created a natural barrier the entity couldn't overcome. The heat, it forced it deeper, away from its sources of power." "Is it destroyed?" I asked, my voice raw from screaming Josephine's name. Mrs. Bennett shook her head. "Not destroyed, contained. Perhaps permanently this time." She pointed to the fractured lake surface. "What you're seeing is its physical form breaking apart, losing cohesion. Without access to new material, it can't maintain itself." I understood what she meant by material, people, victims like Andrea and Max, and now Josephine. The thought made me sick with grief and rage. And the others? The people it took? Are they released, I believe, Mrs. Bennet said gently. Not restored, that would be impossible after assimilation, but freed from the collective consciousness that bound them to the entity. I stared at the transformed lake, wanting to believe her but consumed by the knowledge of Josephine's sacrifice. She had given her life to end this horror, to free her aunt's spirit and prevent more victims. In the days that followed, as authorities tried to make sense of the natural disaster that had struck Camp Evergreen, I maintained the fiction that Josephine and I had simply been caught in a sudden storm and geological event, that Josephine had been swept away by floodwaters, that the strange lights and sounds reported by other campers were lightning and thunder. The camp closed permanently. The official explanation cited geological instability and unexpected thermal activity, rendering the site unsafe. Most of the staff disappeared quietly, moving on to other jobs in distant places. Mr. Harmon remained to oversee the demolition of the remaining structures and implementation of a permanent restricted zone around the lake. I returned home, carrying the truth with me like a physical weight. I kept my promise to Josephine, visiting her mother to explain what had really happened to Andrea and to her daughter. Whether she believed me or not, I couldn't say, but the letter I received months later, thanking me for giving her closure, after so many years of uncertainty, suggested that on some level she accepted the truth. Sometimes in my dreams, I still see Josephine's face in that final moment. Not afraid, but resolute. I see Andrea too and others I never knew, their features gradually separating from the grotesque collective, finding peace as they dissolved not into the entity, but into freedom. The lake remains cordoned off, classified as a geological hazard zone. Satellite images show it has continued to change, becoming smaller and more obviously geothermal in nature. Scientists study it from a distance, puzzled by its rapid transformation but unwilling to approach too closely. They report that the water temperature remains unusually high, that wildlife avoids the area, that instruments malfunction when placed too near the shore. What they don't report, what they can't measure, is the absence. The lake is just a lake now. The weight of malevolence that hung over it for centuries has lifted. The hungry presence that waited in its depths has retreated to some place we can't reach. I know this because I visited once, a year after it happened. Standing at the edge of the restricted zone, I felt nothing calling to me. No whispers, no unsettling awareness of being watched. Just the ordinary sounds of wind through trees and water lapping at a rocky shore. Before leaving, I placed flowers on the fractured master stone, not just for Josephine and Andrea, but for all those whose names were carved into its surface, the victims and the guardians. The sacrificed and the saved. The entity may not be destroyed, may never be truly gone, but it is contained, weakened, pushed back to whatever dark place spawned it. And if someday it begins to rise again, the knowledge of how to fight it remains, in my memories, in the geological records, in the truth I've preserved. Some nightmares can't be defeated entirely, but they can be faced, understood, and ultimately contained. I haven't been swimming since that summer. I probably never will again. Some fears mark you permanently, become part of who you are. But I've learned to live with the memories, to use them as a reminder of both human fragility and strength, of how much we risk when we ignore the warnings of the past, and how much we can accomplish when we face our deepest fears together. Based on the title, you're probably thinking this story is about a creepy old abandoned cabin. That assumption would be completely wrong. The cabin I'm about to tell you about is actually very modern, built just 12 years ago with all the latest amenities and technology. My friend Jordan still lives there with his family to this day, though I often wonder how they manage it. The cabin sits in one of the most beautiful parts of northern Idaho, positioned perfectly alongside the rushing waters of the Clearwater River. The structure itself is impressive. 3 stories of contemporary architecture with floor-to-ceiling windows, exposed wooden beams, and a wraparound deck that offers breathtaking views of the surrounding wilderness. Jordan and his family moved there in early 2015, drawn by the isolation and natural beauty that the property offered. When I first met Jordan in college, he would often talk about his family's retreat home. He described it as paradise, a place where you could escape from the chaos of modern life and reconnect with nature. The way he painted the picture, I imagined lazy summer afternoons fishing in the river, evening barbecues on the deck, and peaceful nights listening to the sound of flowing water and rustling leaves. What's not to like about living in such a magnificent place, surrounded by nothing but pristine wilderness and the gentle sounds of nature? Well, as I would soon discover, there was quite a lot not to like. The isolation that seemed so appealing from a distance became something entirely different when experienced firsthand, especially when darkness fell and the true nature of the place began to reveal itself. The first time Jordan invited me to spend a weekend at the cabin, I was genuinely excited. This was in September 2015, about 2 months after we had become friends. I packed my bags eagerly, looking forward to what I assumed would be a relaxing getaway. The drive up to the property took nearly 4 hours from Boise, winding through increasingly remote mountain roads until we finally turned onto a gravel driveway that seemed to stretch on forever. When the cabin finally came into view, I had to admit it was stunning. The modern design contrasted beautifully with the rustic surroundings, and the way the late afternoon sun reflected off the river created an almost magical atmosphere. Jordan's parents, who had been living there full-time since his father's early retirement, greeted us warmly. His mother, Patricia, was a kind woman in her late 50s who seemed genuinely happy to have company. His father, Dennis, was more reserved but friendly enough. As we carried my bags inside, I marveled at the interior. The main living area featured vaulted ceilings, a massive stone fireplace, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a high-end lodge. The kitchen was equipped with professional-grade appliances, and the dining area could easily seat 12 people. Everything was perfect, almost too perfect, as if the family was trying very hard to create an impression of normalcy and comfort. But even during that first evening, I noticed small things that seemed odd. Patricia would frequently glance toward the staircase leading to the upper floors, as if expecting someone to come down. Dennis had installed an unusual number of motion sensor lights around the property, claiming they were necessary for security, though we were literally miles from the nearest neighbor, and Jordan himself seemed more tense than usual, though he attributed it to school stress. That first night, Jordan showed me around the house, saving his pride and joy for last, a fully equipped home theater on the basement level. The room was impressive, with a professional-grade projector, surround sound system, and theater seating for 8 people. The walls were painted a deep burgundy, and heavy curtains blocked out any outside light when closed. Jordan had spent considerable time and money creating what he called his perfect movie experience. However, there was something unsettling about the space when the projector and screen were not in use. The room felt oppressively dark, even with the recessed lighting turned on. The burgundy walls seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating shadows in corners that appeared deeper than they should have been. The air felt heavier down there, thicker somehow, as if the ventilation system couldn't quite manage to circulate fresh air properly. We decided to spend the evening playing video games on Jordan's PlayStation 5, which was connected to the theater's massive screen. The game we chose was a racing simulator. Nothing scary or intense, just some friendly competition to pass the time. The surround sound made every engine rev and tire screech feel incredibly realistic, and for a while I was genuinely enjoying myself. We had been playing for about an hour when something happened that I still can't fully explain. We were in the middle of a particularly competitive race when the PlayStation console suddenly shut off completely. Not just the game. The entire system powered down as if someone had unplugged it from the wall. The sudden silence in the room was deafening after the constant noise of the racing game. The lights in the theater were dimmed to enhance the gaming experience, so the room wasn't in complete darkness, but it wasn't well lit either. There was just enough illumination to make out the general shapes of furniture and equipment, but details were lost in the murky atmosphere. Everything seemed to take on an ominous quality in that reduced lighting, as if ordinary objects were transformed into something more threatening. I turned to Jordan to make some joke about the power going out, but the words died in my throat when I saw his face. The color had drained from his complexion so completely that he looked like he was about to be sick. His eyes were fixed on something behind me, and his mouth was slightly open in what appeared to be shock or terror. He wasn't looking at me at all. His gaze was focused intently on a point somewhere over my left shoulder. "We need to leave this room right now," he said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but carried an urgency that made my heart start beating faster. He didn't explain why, didn't wait for questions, just stood up slowly and deliberately, never taking his eyes off whatever he was seeing behind me. Every instinct told me to turn around and look, to see what had captured his attention so completely, but something in his expression warned me against it. Instead, I followed his lead and stood up carefully, fighting the overwhelming urge to spin around and confront whatever was there. The feeling of being watched, of having someone or something directly behind me, was so intense it was almost unbearable. We moved toward the door with deliberate slowness, Jordan slightly ahead of me but constantly glancing back to monitor whatever he was seeing. The walk to the exit felt like it took forever, though it couldn't have been more than 10 seconds. Every step felt measured and careful, as if sudden movement might trigger some kind of response from whatever presence had joined us in that room. Once we were safely out of the theater and had climbed the stairs to the main floor, I immediately demanded an explanation. Jordan closed the basement door firmly behind us and engaged the lock, something I noticed he did with particular care, as if he was securing something dangerous rather than simply closing off a room. "What exactly did you see down there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through my system. Jordan ran his hands through his hair and took a deep breath before answering. "After the PlayStation shut off," he began, "I saw the silhouette of a man standing directly behind you. Not just a shadow or a trick of the light. A distinct human shape, tall and broad-shouldered, standing maybe 2 feet behind your chair." The way he described it, with such specific detail and absolute certainty, made my skin crawl. I found myself unconsciously reaching back to touch my shoulders, as if I might still feel the presence of whoever or whatever had been looming behind me. "The figure wasn't moving," Jordan continued, "just standing there, perfectly still like it was, watching us play. But here's the thing that really scared me. I could see through it slightly, like it wasn't completely solid, but it was definitely there. And when I looked directly at it, I got the feeling that it knew I could see it." This revelation opened the floodgates, and Jordan began telling me about other incidents that had been occurring in the house, things that had been happening for years, ever since his family had moved in. As he spoke, I realized that our experience in the theater room was just the tip of the iceberg, a minor incident compared to the ongoing supernatural activity that plagued the property. He told me about the nightly disturbances in his bedroom that occurred with clockwork regularity. Every night at approximately 5 in the morning, the door to his room would begin opening and closing repeatedly. Not just once or twice, but continuously for about 5 minutes, as if someone was playing. An extremely persistent and disturbing prank. The sound would wake him every time, the creak of hinges, the click of the latch, the soft thud as the door met the frame. Initially, Jordan had assumed it was a problem with the house settling or perhaps air pressure changes affecting the door mechanism. But when he mentioned it to his father, Dennis revealed that he had personally installed and adjusted that door, ensuring it was perfectly balanced and properly latched. There was no mechanical reason for it to behave that way. Even more disturbing were the incidents that occurred when Jordan ventured outside alone. On multiple occasions, usually during late evening or early morning hours, he would hear his own voice calling to him from deep in the woods. Not just someone calling his name, but his actual voice, with his exact intonation and speech patterns, shouting from somewhere in the dark forest that surrounded the property. "The first time it happened," Jordan explained, "I actually answered back thinking maybe there was some kind of echo effect I didn't understand. But the voice would respond, having conversations with me, asking me to come into the woods. It knew things about me, personal things, and it would use that information to try to convince me to leave the safety of the yard. The most recent incident had occurred just a few weeks before my visit. Jordan and I had been talking on a video call when both of us heard distinct laughter in the background of his audio feed. It was the unmistakable sound of a child giggling, high-pitched and gleeful, but there were no children in the house at the time. Jordan was alone, his parents having gone into town for supplies. When I asked him about it during the call, Jordan had looked genuinely confused and slightly frightened. He muted his microphone and spent several minutes searching the house, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. He found nothing, but the laughter had been clear and distinct, definitely coming from somewhere inside the house. As Jordan continued sharing these experiences, I began to understand why he had seemed so tense during my visit. Living with this kind of constant supernatural activity would be exhausting for anyone. But he had been dealing with it for months without telling anyone, probably worried that people would think he was losing his mind. The mystery deepened when he told me about an encounter his family had during their first summer at the property. Because the cabin sat directly beside the Clearwater River, it was common for rafting groups to use their backyard as a rest stop or launching point. Jordan's family had always been welcoming to these river enthusiasts, often providing cold drinks and allowing people to use their restroom facilities. One particular family had stopped by on a beautiful July afternoon in 2015, just a few months after Jordan's family had moved in. They were an older couple with 2 teenage children, friendly and appreciative of the hospitality. During their brief visit, they mentioned how pleased they were to finally see the house occupied and showing signs of life. This comment confused Patricia, who explained that the house had been lived in continuously before their family purchased it. The previous owners had been an elderly couple named the Hendersons, who had built the house and lived there for nearly a decade before deciding to downsize and move closer to their grandchildren. But the rafting family insisted that wasn't what they had observed during their regular trips down the river. "We've been coming down this stretch of water for 15 years, the father had explained, "and that house has been dark and empty-looking for at least the last 5 years. All the windows were always covered, no lights were ever on, and we never saw any signs of people living there." This contradiction bothered Patricia enough that she decided to do some research. She contacted the Hendersons directly, and they confirmed that they had indeed lived in the house continuously until the sale. Mrs. Henderson was particularly adamant about this point, explaining that they had loved the house and only left reluctantly, due to age-related mobility issues. "But here's where it gets really strange," Jordan continued. "When my mom asked Mrs. Henderson about the windows being covered, she insisted they had never covered their windows. She said they loved the natural light and the views of the river too much to ever block them out. She also mentioned that they kept lights on in the evening specifically because they enjoyed watching the sunset reflect off the water." The contradiction was impossible to reconcile. Either the rafting family was mistaken about what they had observed year after year, or something had been preventing the house from appearing occupied even when people were living there normally. Neither explanation made complete sense, but combined with the supernatural incidents Jordan's family was experiencing, it suggested that whatever presence haunted the property had been active for quite some time. Dennis had tried to investigate the history of the land before the house was built, but records for such remote properties were often incomplete. What he did discover was that the area had been used as hunting grounds by various Native American tribes for centuries, and there had been a small logging operation in the vicinity during the early 1900s. Beyond that, the land had remained largely undeveloped wilderness. Over the following months, I stayed in regular contact with Jordan, and the supernatural activity at the cabin seemed to be intensifying rather than diminishing. What had started as occasional strange incidents was becoming a daily part of life for his family, and the psychological toll was becoming increasingly apparent. The nighttime disturbances in Jordan's bedroom had evolved beyond just the door opening and closing. He began waking to find his furniture rearranged, not dramatically but subtly enough that he would notice something was different. His desk chair would be turned to face the bed instead of the desk. Books on his shelf would be in different positions than where he had left them. His clothes would be laid out on the floor in neat arrangements as if someone was carefully organizing them while he slept. Patricia started reporting similar incidents throughout the house. Kitchen utensils would be found in wrong drawers, always placed with deliberate care rather than carelessly tossed. Picture frames would be turned to face the wall, but only certain ones, and always the photographs that showed the family looking happy or relaxed. It was as if whatever presence inhabited the house disapproved of their contentment. The incidents outside the house became more frequent and more aggressive. Dennis installed motion sensor cameras around the property perimeter, hoping to document whatever was causing the disturbances. The cameras captured hours of footage showing lights turning on in response to movement. But the video never showed what was triggering the sensors. Trees would sway without wind, and snow would show footprint patterns that appeared and disappeared between camera cycles. One particularly disturbing piece of footage showed the back deck furniture being systematically rearranged over the course of an hour. Chairs were moved to form circles, tables were flipped upside down, and cushions were arranged in specific patterns. But the cameras never captured any person or thing actually moving the furniture. The items simply appeared in new positions each time the motion sensors triggered. Jordan's experience with hearing his own voice from the woods became a nightly occurrence. The voice would call out just after sunset, always from the same general direction, always using his exact vocal patterns and inflections. But the conversations became more sophisticated and more disturbing. The voice began referencing private conversations Jordan had with family members, repeating things that had been said inside the house where no outsider could have overheard. "It's not just mimicking my voice anymore," Jordan told me during one particularly distressing phone call. "It's like whatever this thing is has been listening to everything we say, learning about us, studying our family dynamics. Last night, it started telling me things about my parents' relationship that I didn't even know, private things they had discussed when they thought no one was listening." The psychological impact on the family was becoming severe. Patricia developed chronic insomnia, afraid to fall asleep because she would inevitably wake to find evidence that someone or something had been in the house while the family slept. Dennis became obsessed with installing additional security measures. More cameras, better locks, motion sensors inside the house as well as outside. But none of these precautions seemed to deter whatever was tormenting them. Jordan's grades began suffering as the lack of quality sleep and constant stress affected his ability to concentrate. He started spending more time away from the house, often staying overnight with friends or camping out in his car rather than returning home. But even when he was away, he would receive text messages from his parents describing new incidents that occurred in his absence. By December 2015, the situation had become unbearable for Jordan's family. Dennis decided to take a more systematic approach to understanding what was happening. He contacted the local sheriff's department, but their response was predictably skeptical. Without evidence of actual criminal activity or property damage, there was little they could do beyond suggesting the family install additional security measures. Dennis then reached out to the County Historical Society, hoping to learn more about the land's history before the house was built. What he discovered was both fascinating and deeply troubling. The area where the cabin sat had indeed been used by indigenous peoples for centuries, but it had specifically been avoided for permanent settlements due to what tribal elders described as restless spirits that inhabited the woods. According to the historical records, early European settlers had also reported strange incidents in the area. A logging camp established in 1902 had been abandoned after just 6 months due to what the foreman described as unnatural disturbances that made it impossible for workers to sleep or focus on their tasks. Tools would go missing and reappear in impossible locations. Voices would call out from empty areas of the forest, and several workers reported seeing figures moving through the trees that would vanish when approached directly. The most significant discovery came from a newspaper archive dating back to 1957. A hunting cabin had been built roughly a quarter-mile from where Jordan's family's house now stood. The article described how the cabin's occupants, a family of 4 who used it as a weekend retreat, had all died in their sleep during what was supposed to be a relaxing February vacation. The official cause of death was listed as carbon monoxide, poisoning from a faulty heating system, but the article included quotes from the investigating officers that raised disturbing questions. The family members had been found in different rooms of the cabin, as if they had been trying to escape something. The front door was found wide open despite the freezing temperatures, and several windows had been broken from the inside. Most unsettling of all, neighbors who had discovered the bodies reported that the family's car was found running in the driveway with the headlights on, as if someone had been trying to leave in the middle of the night but never made it out of the property. Dennis shared this information with Patricia and Jordan, and they began to understand that their experiences were part of a much larger pattern of supernatural activity that had been affecting the area for decades, possibly centuries. The realization was both validating, they weren't losing their minds, and terrifying. They were dealing with something that had apparently driven people away or worse for generations. The winter of 2015-2016 brought the supernatural activity to a crescendo that would ultimately force Jordan's family to make an impossible decision. The incidents were no longer confined to specific times or locations within the house. They were happening constantly, affecting every aspect of daily life. January brought what Jordan described as the most terrifying night of his life. He woke at his usual 5 a.m. to the sound of his bedroom door opening and closing, but this time the activity didn't stop after 5 minutes. It continued for over an hour, accompanied by footsteps in the hallway that seemed to pace back and forth outside his room. When Jordan finally worked up the courage to open the door and investigate, he found the hallway empty, but noticed that every other door on the second floor was now standing wide open. His parents' bedroom, the guest rooms, the bathrooms, even the linen closet, all of them had been opened during the night. But his parents were still asleep in their room, and they insisted the next morning that they hadn't heard anything unusual. The kitchen became a particular focus of supernatural attention. Patricia would wake each morning to find elaborate arrangements of dishes, utensils, and food items covering every available surface. Not messy or destructive arrangements, but carefully planned displays that looked almost like altar offerings. Candles that the family didn't own would appear lit on the counters. Fresh flowers would be arranged in vases, despite the fact that it was the middle of winter and no flowers were growing anywhere on the property. The voice in the woods became more persistent and more demanding. It no longer just called Jordan's name or tried to engage him in conversation. Now it would scream his name repeatedly for hours at a time, sometimes continuing from sunset until dawn. The voice developed an angry, desperate quality that made it sound less like mimicry and more like an actual person in distress. It started saying things that made me think it was trapped somehow, Jordan explained during one of our phone conversations. It would beg me to help it, claim that it needed me to come into the woods so it could go home. But there was something wrong about the way it said these things, like it was reading from a script rather than expressing genuine emotion. The most disturbing incident occurred in February 2016, exactly 1 year after the historical cabin deaths that Dennis had discovered in his research. Jordan woke in the middle of the night to find his bedroom filled with an overwhelming smell of smoke. Despite the fact that no fires were burning anywhere in the house, the smoke smell was so intense that he could barely breathe, and his eyes began watering immediately. He stumbled to his bedroom door, intending to wake his parents and evacuate the house, but found that the door would not open. The handle turned freely, and he could hear the latch mechanism operating normally, but the door remained firmly closed as if something was holding it shut from the outside. He pounded on the door and shouted for help, but his parents' room was directly across the hall, and they later insisted they had heard nothing. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the smoke smell began to dissipate, and the door suddenly opened normally. Jordan rushed to check on his parents and found them sleeping peacefully, unaware that anything had happened. A search of the entire house revealed no source for the smoke smell, and none of the family's smoke detectors had been triggered. By March 2016, the psychological and physical toll of living in the cabin had become unbearable for Jordan's family. Patricia had lost nearly 20 pounds due to stress and lack of sleep. Dennis had developed a nervous habit of constantly checking locks and security cameras even when he was away from the house. Jordan was struggling to maintain his grades and had developed anxiety severe enough to require medication. The final incident that convinced them to leave occurred on a Sunday evening in late March. The family was gathered in the living room, watching television when every electronic device in the house began operating simultaneously. The kitchen appliances all turned on at once, the blender, coffee maker, microwave, and dishwasher all running at maximum settings. Upstairs, radios began playing different stations at full volume. The home theater system activated and began cycling through inputs, producing a chaotic mix of sounds and static. But most frightening of all, the house's intercom system began, broadcasting the conversations the family was having in the living room, playing their words back to them with a several-second delay. They could hear their own voices coming through speakers throughout the house, creating an echo effect that made normal conversation impossible. The electrical chaos continued for nearly an hour, despite Dennis's attempts to shut down the main breaker. Even with the power cut off, several battery-operated devices continued functioning, including smoke detectors that began shrieking randomly and a weather radio that began broadcasting what sounded like emergency alerts in languages none of them recognized. When the activity finally stopped, the house fell into a silence so complete and oppressive that it felt more threatening than the previous chaos. The family spent that night in a hotel in town, and they never spent another night in the cabin. The process of moving out took several months, partly due to the remote location and partly because of ongoing supernatural interference. Moving crews, reported equipment malfunctions, unexplained accidents, and several workers quit after experiencing what they described as overwhelming feelings of dread while working on the property. Jordan's family eventually sold the house at a significant loss to a couple from California who were looking for a remote retreat property. During the sales process, Dennis felt obligated to disclose the supernatural activity they had experienced, but the buyers dismissed these accounts as products of isolation and imagination. Jordan maintains contact with the area through local social media groups, and he keeps track of what happens to the property. The California couple lasted less than 6 months before putting the house back on the market. Since then, it has been sold 3 more times, with each ownership period lasting less than a year. The house currently sits empty again, just as the Rafting family had described seeing it years before Jordan's family moved in. Local real estate agents have stopped trying to market the property actively, and it has developed a reputation in the area as that haunted house by the river. Jordan and his family eventually settled in Arizona, as far from the Idaho wilderness as they could manage while staying in the western United States. They rarely speak about their experiences at the cabin, though Jordan still wakes up at 5 a.m. sometimes, expecting to hear his bedroom door opening and closing. When people ask him about the most remote place he's ever lived, Jordan just smiles and changes the subject. He's never returned to Idaho, and he has no plans to ever go back. Some places, he says, are meant to be left alone, and some questions are better left unanswered. The cabin still stands by the river, its modern design and beautiful setting unchanged. But the windows remain dark, and rafters who pass by report the same emptiness that was observed decades ago. Whatever haunts that property continues to wait, patient and persistent, for the next family brave enough or foolish enough to call it home. As for what happened there to make it so haunted, that question continues to plague Jordan's thoughts. But after everything his family endured, he's no longer certain he wants to know the answer. I was 17 at the time, restless with the particular brand of boredom that afflicts teenagers in the digital age. My grandparents owned a sprawling ranch nestled among the pine-covered slopes of the Rim Mountains in Arizona. The property featured their main house, a sturdy 2-story log structure, and 7 smaller rental cabins scattered throughout the property, each positioned to offer privacy and stunning views of the wilderness. During spring and summer, my family would visit regularly, enjoying hikes through wildflower-filled meadows and cool evenings under star-filled skies. But winter visits were rare. The mountain roads became treacherous, heavy snow isolated the ranch, and temperatures plummeted well below freezing. Yet that February, my parents decided we needed a family getaway. "It'll be good to disconnect," my father said, eyes fixed on the road as our SUV climbed higher into the mountains. "No internet, minimal cell service, just family time." My brother Andrew, 10 years my senior, sat in the back seat with his wife Joanna and their children, 4-year-old Emma and 2-year-old Ben. My cousin Nell was squeezed between the child seats, her attention fixed on a dog-eared paperback. Weather. Report says we might get another 8 inches tonight, Mom commented, studying her phone before the signal disappeared entirely. The SUV's wipers fought against the thickening snowfall as we made the final turn onto the unmarked gravel road, leading to the ranch. The snow muffled everything, creating that particular winter silence that feels both peaceful and somehow watchful. Our tires crunched over the fresh powder as we pulled up to the main house. Grandpa Russell stood on the porch, his tall frame wrapped in a heavy wool coat, breath visible in the cold air. His weathered face broke into a warm smile as we tumbled out of the vehicle, stiff from the 3-hour drive. "Perfect timing," he called out, helping us with our bags. "Your grandmother just pulled a venison stew off the stove." Inside, the house was warm and fragrant with cooking smells. Grandma June welcomed us with firm hugs, her silver hair pulled back in her usual neat bun. The familiar surroundings, antler, chandeliers, well-worn leather furniture, and walls lined with family photos, created an immediate sense of comfort. After dinner, as the adults talked around the fireplace, I watched the snow intensify outside the large picture window. The flakes grew larger, illuminated by the porch lights, swirling in hypnotic patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Something about their movement made me uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. "You and Nell will be staying in Pine Cabin," Grandma informed me, breaking my trance. "We've got the heater running already." Pine Cabin was the closest of the rental cabins to the main house, though still a good 100 yards through the woods. I nodded, unaware that this routine arrangement would become anything but ordinary. Morning brought brilliant sunshine reflecting off pristine snow. The ranch transformed overnight into a winter wonderland, with snow-laden pine branches creating natural archways along the paths between cabins. After breakfast, Andrew suggested we build an igloo for the kids. "I've never seen snow this perfect for packing," he said, demonstrating by forming a perfect snowball with minimal effort. We spent hours in childlike play, crafting a surprisingly sturdy snow structure while Emma and Ben squealed with delight. Yet throughout the day I noticed Grandpa frequently scanning the tree line, his expression unreadable. Once I caught him staring intently at something in the distance, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle that always hung above the kitchen door when we visited. "Everything okay?" I asked. He blinked, as if returning from deep thought. "Just keeping an eye out. Had some trouble with predators lately. Probably just coyotes getting bold with the harsh winter." But something in his tone suggested he wasn't being entirely forthcoming. I noticed he'd been talking in hushed tones with my father and Andrew, conversations that abruptly shifted when anyone else approached. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered again, promising more snow. The temperature dropped noticeably, and we retreated indoors for hot chocolate and board games. I observed subtle changes in the adults' behavior, the way they tensed at unexpected sounds, how they checked door locks twice, the flashlights and radios placed strategically near entrances. "What's really going on?" I finally asked my mother, as she prepared sandwich plates for dinner. She hesitated, knife suspended above the bread. "Nothing you need to worry about. Just stay close to the cabins after dark, okay?" Nell suggested we continue our marathon of board games after dinner, but I declined, feeling unusually fatigued from the day's activities and the altitude. "I think I'll head back to the cabin early," I said, suppressing a yawn. "I need to finish the book I started." "I'll come with you," Nell offered, but Grandma interrupted. "Actually, Nell, would you mind helping me organize some photo albums? I've been meaning to sort through them, and your eye for detail would be appreciated." The request seemed oddly timed, but Nell agreed. "I'll join you later then," she told me. "Don't fall asleep with the light on like last time." As I prepared to leave, Grandpa handed me a powerful flashlight. "Stay on the path," he instructed firmly, "and lock the door behind you." The intensity in his eyes made me pause. Is there something I should know? He squeezed my shoulder. Just being cautious. The mountains demand respect, especially in winter. The path to Pine Cabin was well marked with solar lights, but darkness had descended completely, rendering them little more than dim beacons in a sea of black. The moon remained hidden behind thick clouds, and the snowfall had resumed, gentler, now but persistent. My flashlight carved a narrow tunnel of visibility through the darkness. Beyond its beam, the forest was an impenetrable wall of shadow. Every few steps, I would swing the light in a wide arc, illuminating sections of woods that immediately returned to darkness once the beam passed. The temperature had plummeted further, creating that peculiar silence unique to extreme cold. Silence so complete it seemed to absorb sound rather than merely lack it. My boots crunched rhythmically in the fresh powder, the noise unnaturally loud against the backdrop of nothing. Halfway to the cabin, I stopped. Not consciously, not with any clear thought. My body simply ceased moving as if responding to some primal warning system buried deep in my evolutionary past. The hairs on my arms and neck rose simultaneously, and my breath caught in my throat. I was being watched. Slowly, I turned in a complete circle, sweeping the flashlight beam across the surrounding forest. The light reflected off snow-covered branches and created strange, shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Nothing concrete, nothing I could point to, yet the feeling of observation intensified. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. My voice sounded small and vulnerable in the vast darkness. No response came, save for a distant cracking sound. Perhaps a branch giving way under the weight of accumulated snow, perhaps something else entirely. I quickened my pace, no longer concerned with appearing afraid. Pine Cabin materialized from the darkness like a sanctuary, its windows glowing with the warm light I'd left on before dinner. I practically ran the final yards, fumbled with the key, and burst inside, slamming the door behind me and engaging both the deadbolt and the secondary chain lock. The cabin's interior offered immediate comfort: a queen-sized bed with a handmade quilt, a small bathroom, a writing desk beneath the window, and a comfortable reading chair. A skylight above the bed would normally offer stargazing opportunities, but tonight showed only darkness and occasional snowflakes. I tried to shake off my unease, attributing it to an overactive imagination fueled by the adult's mysterious behavior. After washing up and changing into warm pajamas, I settled onto the bed with my Kindle, determined to lose myself in a novel rather than dwell on formless fears. The digital clock on the nightstand showed 9:37 p.m. Nell would likely arrive within the hour, and I looked forward to her company. Until then, I immersed myself in my book, gradually relaxing as the fictional world pulled me away from my surroundings. Until the sound. At first, I wasn't sure I'd heard anything at all. Perhaps just the wind or snow sliding from the roof. But then it came again. A low rumbling sound, not quite a growl, but something deeper, more deliberate. It emanated from directly behind me, from the other side of the window above the headboard. My entire body tensed. The sound came again, louder. This time, impossible to dismiss as anything natural or familiar. With trembling hands, I set my Kindle aside and slowly turned toward the window. What I saw will forever be etched in my memory. Pressed against the glass was a face, or something approximating a face. In the dim light, I could make out features that resembled a wolf: elongated snout, pointed ears, glinting eyes that reflected an unnatural yellow in the cabin light. But the proportions were wrong, the size impossibly large for any canine native to these mountains. I remained frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. The creature's breath fogged the glass in rhythmic pulses, creating and dispelling small circles of condensation. We stared at each other for what felt like eternity, though it could only have been seconds. Then it moved. A limb rose into view, not a paw, but something horrifyingly in between animal and human. Fingers too long, joints too numerous, tipped with curved claws that looked capable of shredding metal. This impossible appendage pressed flat against the window, spreading wide as if measuring the barrier's strength. I scrambled backward off the bed, nearly falling in my haste. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. The window this creature peered through was at least 7 feet off the ground on the outside, where the cabin was built into the sloping mountainside. For its face to be visible required it to stand upright at a height no natural animal could achieve. The claws began to drag downward, creating a sound so grating and deliberate it seemed designed to unnerve. The screech of keratin against glass sent waves of revulsion through my body. I watched, paralyzed, as it traced what appeared to be deliberate patterns, not random scratches, but something with purpose. Then, abruptly, the face withdrew from the window. I heard heavy movement outside, something large circling the cabin with slow, measured steps. Occasional scrapes against the wooden exterior suggested it was testing the structure, searching for weakness. With horror, I realized I had left the front door unlocked for Nell. Adrenaline finally broke my paralysis. I lunged for the door, my stockinged feet sliding on the wooden floor. My hands fumbled with the deadbolt, finally engaging it with a solid click that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet cabin. I added the chain lock as well, though it suddenly seemed flimsy protection against whatever circled outside. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, cursing as I saw the single bar of reception flickering. Uncertainly. Mountain service was always spotty, but the snowstorm made it worse. I dialed my mother's number with shaking fingers, praying the call would connect. Outside, something heavy impacted the side of the cabin. Not a casual brush, but a deliberate strike that made the entire structure shudder. The lights flickered momentarily, plunging the cabin into darkness before humming back to life. The call connected just as another blow struck the cabin, this one powerful enough to knock a framed landscape from the wall. It crashed to the floor, glass shattering. "Mom!" I screamed into the phone as soon as I heard her voice. "Something's trying to get in. There's something outside the cabin." Her response was immediate. "Stay away from the windows. We're coming." Another impact, this time against the door itself. The wood creaked ominously, and I could hear the deadbolt rattling in its housing. Whatever was out there understood doors, understood locks. This wasn't mindless animal behavior. "Hurry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if she could still hear me. The phone showed the call had dropped. I retreated to the bathroom, the only space without windows, clutching the flashlight Grandpa had given me like a talisman. Outside, the creature continued its methodical assault on the cabin, testing different entry points with frightening intelligence. The minutes stretched endlessly as I huddled against the bathtub, ears straining for any sound that might indicate help was coming. When the distant rumble of an engine finally penetrated the noise of the assault, the relief was so intense I nearly collapsed. The creature's reaction to the approaching vehicle was immediate. The assault on the cabin ceased, replaced by what sounded like rapid movement through the snow. I heard the growl of my grandfather's truck drawing closer, its headlights briefly, illuminating the bathroom through the crack beneath the door. "Riley," my grandfather's voice called out, deep and authoritative. "Are you in there?" I burst from the bathroom, still clutching the flashlight. "I'm here. Don't come in without a weapon." Through the window beside the door, I could see my grandfather, father, and 2 uncles, Uncle Daniel and Uncle Peter, all armed with hunting rifles. My grandfather carried his prized Remington 700, a serious weapon he used for elk hunting. They formed a protective semicircle, scanning the surroundings with practiced movements that spoke of military training from their younger days. "Unlock the door, Riley," my father called. "Quick now." I disengaged the locks with trembling hands and nearly fell into my father's arms as he entered. Uncle Daniel and Uncle Peter remained outside, rifles raised, moving in slow circles as they surveyed the darkness beyond the cabin's immediate vicinity. "What happened?" Dad asked, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. The words tumbled out in a confused rush. The face at the window, the hand that wasn't a hand, the methodical testing of the cabin's defenses. As I spoke, Grandpa examined the window where I'd first seen the creature. "Look here," he said grimly, pointing his flashlight. In the beam, deep scratches were visible in the wooden frame surrounding the glass. Not random damage, but deliberate markings that almost resembled crude symbols. Uncle Peter called from outside. "Russell, you need to see this." We joined them, my father keeping a protective arm around my shoulders. Uncle Peter's flashlight illuminated the snow beneath the elevated side of the cabin, the side where I'd seen the creature at the window. Imprinted in the fresh powder were tracks unlike anything I'd ever seen. They resembled wolf prints in their general shape, but were massively oversized, each easily larger than my grandfather's outstretched hand. More disturbing were the inconsistencies in their formation, sometimes showing distinct toe pads like a canine, other times displaying what looked disturbingly like elongated finger marks. "What made these?" I whispered. The four men exchanged looks heavy with meaning. Grandpa's weathered face was grim in the harsh flashlight beam. "We need to get back to the main house," he said instead of answering. "Now." As we hurried along the path, Uncle Daniel and Uncle Peter positioned themselves at the front and rear of our group, rifles ready. My father and grandfather flanked me, their eyes constantly scanning the darkness between the trees. "There's something you should see," Grandpa said quietly as we walked. He directed his flashlight toward a massive pine about 20 feet off, the path. Deep gouges marred its trunk, vertical scrapes that extended upward far beyond the reach of a standing man, at least 20 feet high. "Found these 3 days ago," he continued. "Similar marks on trees throughout the property. Game. Cameras keep getting destroyed before we can retrieve any footage." "What is it?" I asked, voice barely audible over the crunching snow beneath our boots. "Don't know for certain," Grandpa admitted. "But it's big, it's smart, and it's not natural to these mountains." The main house was ablaze with light when we arrived, every exterior lamp illuminated, casting harsh shadows across the snow-covered yard. Mom rushed out to meet us, wrapping me in a fierce embrace before ushering me inside where Grandma, Nell, Andrew, Joanna, and the children waited anxiously. Emma and Ben had been put to bed in the upstairs guest room, mercifully unaware of the tension permeating the house. The adults gathered in the kitchen, voices low but urgent. "I told you it was escalating," Grandpa said to my father. "This isn't random wildlife behavior." Uncle Peter placed his rifle on the kitchen table, a breach of Grandma's usual house, rules that she didn't comment on. "We should call Fish and Wildlife again." "They didn't take us seriously last time," Uncle Daniel countered. "Suggested it was just a particularly large black bear despite the evidence." "What exactly is happening?" "Here?" Nell demanded, her usual composure frayed. "What was out there?" Grandpa sighed heavily, exchanging glances with Grandma before addressing us all. "Something's been stalking the property for about 3 weeks now. Started with missing chickens, then one of the barn cats disappeared. Last week we found one of the yearling calves dead in the north pasture, not killed for food, just torn apart. And you didn't think to warn us before we came up here?" Mom's voice held a sharp edge. "We didn't want to worry you unnecessarily," Grandma interjected. "Russell thought it might move on once the weather improved. Predators get desperate during hard winters." "This isn't desperation," I said, all eyes turning to me. Whatever I saw was intelligent. It was testing the cabin, looking for ways in. And those scratches on the window frame, they looked deliberate, like it was marking territory. A heavy silence followed my words. Grandpa nodded slowly. "Riley's right. This isn't normal predator behavior." "I've called the ranger station," Uncle Daniel announced, returning from the living room where he'd been on the landline. "They're sending someone first thing tomorrow, but with the snow it could be midday before they arrive." Grandpa loaded shells into his shotgun with practiced efficiency. "We'll take watches through the night, 2-hour shifts, pairs at all times. Peter and I will take first watch, Daniel and Andrew second, then John and I will take the pre-dawn hours." No one argued with the arrangement. The women and I were tasked with checking all windows and doors, ensuring every possible entry point was secured. The ranch house was built with security in mind, Solid oak doors, reinforced frames, windows that could be barricaded if necessary. As we worked, I described in greater detail what I'd seen at the cabin. The more I spoke, the more I realized how difficult it was to accurately convey the wrongness of the creature, how it seemed to occupy an unsettling middle ground between wolf and human, between animal instinct and calculated intelligence. "I've heard stories," Grandma said quietly as we checked the latches on the living room windows. "Old tales from the indigenous people who lived in these mountains long before European settlers arrived. Stories about creatures that walk between, forms that hunt not just for sustenance but for sport. You think that's what's out there?" I asked, skepticism warring with the vivid memory of what I'd seen. She shook her head. "I think there are things in these mountains that defy easy explanation. Things that modern science hasn't cataloged. Whether it's an undiscovered species or something else entirely, I can't say." Sleep was impossible for most of us that night. I dozed fitfully on the living room sofa, jerking awake at every creak of the old house, every whispered conversation between the men as they changed watch shifts. Through the window, I could see them patrolling the perimeter of the house, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, rifles held ready. Sometime in the early morning hours, I was startled fully awake by urgent voices on the back porch. Uncle Peter and my father were speaking rapidly, their breath visible in the pre-dawn air as I peered through the window. "Circled the entire property," Uncle Peter was saying. "Multiple sets of tracks, all the same type." "How many?" Dad asked, his voice tight. "Hard to be certain. At least 3 distinct individuals based on the stride length and depth." I felt my stomach drop. Not one creature, but several. A pack. Dawn arrived with painful slowness, the sky transitioning from black to deep blue to a pale, washed-out gray that offered little comfort. The snowfall had stopped, but heavy clouds remained, promising more before the day's end. No one had encountered anything during the night watches, though Uncle Daniel reported hearing something large moving through the trees around 3 a.m. Nothing had approached the house directly. After a tense breakfast that no one had much appetite for, Grandpa, Uncle Peter, and my father prepared to visit Pine Cabin in daylight to retrieve our belongings and examine the damage more thoroughly. Andrew would remain at the main house with Uncle Daniel to protect the rest of the family. "I want to come too," I insisted. "I should see it in daylight." After some debate, they reluctantly agreed, provided I stayed close and followed instructions without question. We armed ourselves, the men with rifles, me with Grandpa's heavy maglite that could double as a club if necessary, and set out along the now familiar path. Daylight transformed the forest, rendering it ordinary, almost disappointingly benign after the terrors of the night. The tracks, however, told a different story. In the harsh clarity of morning, they were even more disturbing. Massive prints that followed our path from the main house to the cabin with unsettling precision, veering off occasionally to circle trees or investigate other cabins, but always returning to the main trail. Pine Cabin looked surprisingly intact from the outside, though deep gouges marred the wooden siding in several places. The most concentrated damage was around the windows and door, points of potential entry. "Something tried very hard to get in," Uncle Peter observed, running his fingers along scratches in the door frame that had splintered the solid oak. Inside, I collected my belongings while the men examined the cabin methodically. Grandpa took photographs with a digital camera, documenting the damage for the authorities and insurance purposes. "Look at this pattern," Dad called from the window where I'd first seen the creature. He pointed to the scratches in the wooden frame, which upon closer inspection did indeed form a distinct pattern. 3 vertical lines intersected by 2 horizontal ones. "It's on the door frame too," Uncle Peter noted. "And here, by the bathroom window." Grandpa's expression grew increasingly troubled as we found the same marking repeated throughout the cabin. "This isn't random damage." As we prepared to leave, a truck with Forest Service markings pulled up outside. 2 uniformed rangers emerged, a tall, bearded man in his 50s and a younger woman with sharp eyes that immediately began assessing the scene. "Russell," the older ranger greeted my grandfather with a firm handshake. "Wish we were meeting under better circumstances." I'm taking your reports a lot more seriously after what happened at the Nelson property. Nelson property? Grandpa's voice sharpened. What happened? The Rangers exchanged glances. You haven't heard? 3 nights ago, about 15 miles northeast of here, family of 4, their vacation cabin was broken into. Parents killed, children missing. Signs of large predator activity, but what? My father pressed. But inconsistent with known predator behavior, the female ranger finished. Door was forced open, not clawed through. Food left untouched, and markings on the walls and door frames similar to what I'm seeing here. A cold weight settled in my stomach. The creatures I'd seen weren't just curious or territorial. They were actively hunting humans. While the adults continued their grim conversation, I wandered a short distance from the cabin, needing space to process this new information. The forest seemed to press in around me, no longer benign despite the daylight. A flash of color caught my eye, something red against the pristine white snow about 20 yards from the cabin. Curious, I moved closer, discovering a torn piece of fabric snagged on a low branch. It looked like part of a child's winter coat, the material expensive and relatively new. Grandpa, I called, holding up my discovery. I found something. The Rangers were particularly interested in the fabric, placing it carefully in an evidence bag. This matches the description of what one of the Nelson children was wearing, the female ranger confirmed, her expression grim. Further search of the area revealed more disturbing findings. Additional tracks showing what appeared to be something large dragging a heavy object through the snow, small items of children's clothing, and most chillingly, a distinct trail leading deeper into the forest toward the most remote regions of the mountain range. We need to organize a proper search party, the male ranger decided, already on his radio calling for backup. If there's any chance those children are still alive. We returned to the main house in somber silence, the implications of our discoveries weighing heavily on everyone. The Rangers' backup would arrive within hours, bringing additional personnel, tracking dogs, and more comprehensive equipment. Grandpa insisted we pack immediately and leave before noon. This isn't our fight now, he said firmly. The authorities are taking over, and I want my family safely off this mountain. No one argued. Even Grandma, who typically hated leaving her home, was already packing essentials into well-worn suitcases. We were ready to leave within the hour, vehicles packed, and children secured in their car seats. The Rangers had established a command post at the main house, additional Forest Service and Sheriff's Department vehicles arriving in a steady stream. Men and women in uniform moved with purposeful efficiency, unloading equipment and consulting topographical maps spread across Grandpa's kitchen table. As we prepared to depart, the female ranger approached me. I'd like to get a formal statement from you, she said. You're the only one who saw these creatures clearly. In the stark daylight of the kitchen, surrounded by law enforcement professionals, I felt suddenly self-conscious about my account. Would they believe me? Would they dismiss what I'd seen as the overactive imagination of a frightened teenager? But as I described the events of the previous night, the face at the window, the hand that wasn't quite a hand, the methodical testing of the cabin's defenses, I saw recognition in the Ranger's eyes. This matches other reports we've received, she confirmed when I finished. Isolated incidents over the past decade, but increasing in frequency and boldness over the last 6 months. What are they? I asked, the question that had haunted me since the previous night. She hesitated. Officially, unknown predator species, possibly wolves with genetic abnormalities or bears with unusual behavior patterns. Her voice lowered. Unofficially, something that shouldn't exist, something that's evolving, adapting, learning how to hunt us more effectively. A chill ran through me despite the warmth of the kitchen. Will you find those children? Her expression turned grim. We'll try. But given what we know about these creatures' behavior patterns... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. As we finally drove away from the ranch, I watched through the rear window as the collection of emergency vehicles grew smaller in the distance. The mountain itself seemed to loom over them, ancient and indifferent to human concerns. 3 weeks later, the official search for the Nelson children was called off. The official report cited animal predation as the cause of the parents' deaths. The children were presumed dead, though their bodies were never recovered. Grandpa and Grandma sold the ranch that spring, moving to a retirement community in Phoenix. None of us ever returned to the mountains. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I still wake suddenly with the certainty that something is watching me through my bedroom window. I lie perfectly still, holding my breath, waiting for the sound of claws against glass. The mountains keep their secrets well, but sometimes those secrets venture down into the world of humans, hungry for more than just flesh. They hunger for our fear, our confusion, our desperate need to categorize and understand. Some things defy understanding. Some predators have learned that humans are easy prey when isolated, when comfortable in their perceived safety. Be cautious when you venture into remote places. Pay attention to the warnings your body gives you, that primal fear response that preceded civilization, that tension along your spine that tells you you're being hunted. And if you ever find yourself alone in a cabin in the wilderness, and feel eyes upon you from the darkness beyond your windows, do not assume the barrier between you and what watches is sufficient protection. Lock your doors, stay vigilant, and remember that we have never been the apex predator we believe ourselves to be. God help you if you ever see what I saw that night. The memory alone is enough to make me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world and our place within it. Some watchers should remain unseen,